Can we make a start, please? We've got three papers this morning before coffee, and we start with Verónica Abenza. She's a research fellow at the Complutense University of Madrid, teaching medieval art history, including Byzantine and Islamic. She's also an associate professor at the Autonomous University of Barcelona in the Art and Musicology department. She's published widely papers on medieval art history with a special interest in the patronage of women. And today she's speaking on the Western reception of transcultural objects, a matter of reuse or recycling. Verónica.
There we go. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Thank you very much, Richard. Good morning to everyone. I'm Spanish, so I will be speaking very loud, but in case at any point you can hear me, just tell me, please. Well, once again, good morning to everybody. Well, I first met John McNeill in Palermo in 2013. And just 1 year later, my PhD advisor, Manuel Castiñeras, who is here, he came and told me, well, you know, I'm with the National Museum of Art of Catalonia and the British Archaeological Association. We're organizing this conference on Romanesque art, which will be held in Barcelona in 2014. And Manuel, with his characteristic charm, came and asked me, would you like to help? And like, would you like to give us a hand? And I was just in the first year of my PhD, but it is true that the British Archaeological Association has always committed to supporting young scholars. So on occasion of that conference, and here you can see a beautiful picture of John and Gemma, the conveners of that conference. On that occasion, I had the chance to present my very first research poster. And by then, I was studying objects that are back then art historians referred to as hybrids, objects such as this one that you can see here. Well, the thing is, I finished my poster presentation. The session was drawing to a close, and John came and he offered a remark, which was, I have to say, very kind, but beautifully short. He told me, very interesting, Verónica. So, and that's all he said to me. But the truth is, here I stand 11 years later, studying actually once again the same kind of objects, which we no longer call hybrids, by the way, but transcultural. And I have to say I'm very honored to be here to pay tribute to John's memory, because John McNeill was an extremely generous person when it came to helping young researchers. So for that, I'd like to thank Alex Buchanan, whom I haven't seen this morning, but she's there, and Richard Plan, the conference convener, but also Anne Hicknell and Kate Milburn for their tireless work. You know, I consider you a saint. So, well, to begin with, as you can see on the screen, I'm very aware that the title of my presentation includes several terms that might be considered controversial, terms that many might regard as anachronistic when applied to the study of medieval art. The first of these is the epithet transcultural, a term that refers, obviously, to the concept of And yet, as you can see on the screen, it can be defined in relatively straightforward terms, or as Wolfgang Welsch has recently argued in his book, you can see it here, we have always been transcultural, the arts as an example. Transcultural objects are those that travel across geographical boundaries and extend their useful lives through the accumulation of multiple functions or cultural meanings. Well, the subject of transculturality, of course, has been examined in depth by scholars, including within the specific geographical framework on which I would like to focus today, namely, of course, the Iberian Peninsula. For obvious reasons, when dealing with medieval Iberia, scholarly attention has traditionally centered on transcultural objects originating, as you can see here, in Al-Andalus, or within the broader Islamicate world. Well, unfortunately, I have to say that neither my presentation today nor my current research will address these Andalusian objects. Instead, both my presentation and my current research are concerned with transcultural artifacts from a different cultural sphere or milieu. One that, as you can see here, has received comparatively little attention in the context of medieval Iberia. I am referring, as you come back to see here, two objects whose provenance can be traced to Byzantium and which reached the Iberian Peninsula over the course of the long Middle Ages. Yet, I would like to say a few words about those objects, those other objects, originating from Al-Andalus or from the broader Islamicate world, which were later reused in Christian contexts in medieval Iberia. Just a word, because studies of both national and international scope, from comprehensive surveys of Abinoam Shalem and Gerhard Wolff, to the more detailed analysis of Fernando Valdés and Manuel Casamar, those studies have traditionally argued that these objects should be interpreted through the lens of religious triumphalism. That is to say, as if they were always war trophies or spoils. Well, there is, however, a certain paradox in that. The very term transculturation was coined in 1940 by the Cuban anthropologist Fernando Ortiz in his now well-known, and I'm quoting it in Spanish because he was Cuban, Contrapunteo Cubano del Tabaco y del Azúcar. Ortiz was not trying to describe situations of conflict or domination, but rather to explain processes of cultural interaction based on mutual encounter. I have to say that, in case you are interested, this issue is currently being reviewed by some of the researchers in my research project. This project, as you can see here, from which I'm the principal investigator, was granted in 2023 by the Spanish Ministry of Science and Innovation, and it's titled, you can see here, Intersections of Gender, Transculturality and Identity in Medieval Iberia, the Recycling and Long Life of Objects and Textiles. And I'm leaving here the website, just in case anyone is curious about the Andalusian objects, you know, and about this sort of issue I was talking about. Well, from my perspective, this common association between Andalusian transcultural objects and processes of Christianization has a great deal to do with the fact that these artifacts have almost always been studied through the prism of spolia. And spolia, as our dear John McNeill himself often reminded us, is a process, or was a process, that tends to lead quite inevitably to fragmentation, appropriation, and display. As Eric Fernie reminded us on Friday, when John reflected very much on the idea of spolia in his article here, I'm taking the advice of Richard Jam of using this term because I think it might be better. in his beautiful article, Veteres statuas emit Rome, Romanes attitudes to the past. And as Eric Fernie also pointed out, John drew on the conclusions of David Stoker and Paul Everson, who proposed a useful threefold distinction in the medieval reuse of objects and materials. That is, a casual reuse, or a functional reuse, or an iconic reuse. Well, quite as much as it happened in the Ottonian period, especially after the arrival of Princess Theophano, the Byzantine wife of Otto II, in medieval Iberia too, with very few exceptions, Byzantine transcultural objects were typically reused because of their ideological significance. I'm showing you this map just for you to have this sense of the geographical distribution, of the Byzantine objects that traveled to the Iberian Peninsula in the Middle Ages. Well, so as I was saying, by contrast, a casual or arbitrary form of reuse would occur when, and I quote, objects or materials were reused in a way that disregarded their original formal context and were chosen on grounds of economy and ease. Well, this type of casual reuse, therefore, is perhaps the closest medieval analog to what we would today understand as recycling. This point, in turn, brings us to a longer-standing and much debated issue, that is the perceived distinction between the utilitarian dimension of medieval objects and their more performative or representational character. Well, I'm once again very aware of how anachronistic the use of the term recycling may appear. And yet, medieval societies were consistently engaged in extending the useful life of objects. This was not driven by a social or environmental ethic, of course, nor by a desire to promote sustainability, nor even by concerns about pollution, but rather by the inherent scarcity of resources characteristic of the period. I would argue that if we set aside the modern connotations, I would argue, actually, that if we set aside the modern connotations associated to recycling, we should not only use the term recycling, but apply it directly to the study of the Middle Ages. So let us remember that the three practices that are inherently associated with recycling are quite simply reduction, reuse, and repair. So the notion of reduction refers first and foremost to the minimization of material consumption. In this respect, one of the most familiar and thoroughly studied examples of material reduction in the medieval world is undoubtedly that of medieval palimpsests. I would like to show you just the one you have on the screen. This is one such palimpsest that is currently being investigated within a project of the Austrian Academy of the Sciences. And this brings me to the second practice associated to recycling, which is that of reuse, which refers to the reprocessing of materials. With the sole aim of being illustrative, as you can see here, I have taken the liberty of bringing together a series of documentary sources that demonstrate how, in the Iberian Peninsula, between the 10th and the 15th centuries, the practice of material reuse was not only common, but structurally embedded. These sources refer more specifically to the recycling of metals. They mention a wide range of objects, from everyday items such as cups, jugs, plates, or small spoons, to pieces of jewelry and weapons, including swords, spears, or sword pommels, made of gold and silver, which were donated for the production of a wide variety of liturgical objects. Well, we know that at times we can observe that metal objects, were not donated in order to be remelted, but rather to be sold. In such cases, the sale of these metal objects would yield an amount of silver or even gold equivalent to the value of the metal that would subsequently be used to create a new object. It would be the case of this reference here, the candelabra, chandelier, because this is the case in which we know that it wasn't a case for the chandeliers to be remelted, because we know that iron objects could not be fully melted, owing technological limitations. As such, normally, these iron objects would have been sold, or alternatively, they would have been reshaped by heating and hammering, in a different method, of course, of reprocessing the material. As Ricardo Córdoba has convincingly shown, in medieval Iberia, raw materials were expensive, the exploitation of mines was technically challenging, and mineral sources were often located far from the centers of consumption. Consequently, as these documents that I've just shown you make clear, gold, silver, copper, tin, and lead from everyday objects, jewelry, and weapons were commonly remelted and very often combined with reused metal shavings in order to produce new metalwork. Finally, in the third case, and once again, purely for illustrative purposes, I have also brought together a small number of documents from medieval Iberia that allow us to glimpse practices of repair. In these sources, as you can see here in the middle column, the terminology used to denote restoration varies considerably. Different terms, as you can see on the screen, are employed. And yet, in every case, they refer to the repair of objects with the explicit aim of extending their useful life. So, as I suggested earlier, we can definitely relate with the three practices associated with recycling. Also, as I suggested earlier, objects from Byzantium were only rarely reused in the Christian West for reasons of economy or practical convenience. Remember, I told you it was more often because of ideological reasons. This in turn prompts a further question. Do we have any surviving objects whose medieval or transcultural trajectories might be better understood through the lens of recycling rather than that of spolia? And the answer, spoiler alert, yeah, the answer is that we do. Yeah. So let me then introduce you to the long and remarkably complex biography of an object preserved in the treasury of Toledo Cathedral. This is a Byzantine steatite icon depicting the full cycle of the Dodecaorton, that is the 12 Byzantine liturgical feast cycle. In the following, I will focus on three main aspects of this object. First, the material and iconographic singularity of the icon. Second, the inscription on its reverse and its numismatic implications. And third, the relationship between this object and certain inventory practices at Toledo Cathedral. Well, I would like to begin by considering the material and iconographic singularity of the icon. The icon, you have the measurements here, measures over 26 centimeters in height and over 18 centimeters in width. It was carved from a single block of gray-green steatite. Although its dimensions may appear modest at first glance, this icon is in fact the largest known example among the more than, and this is important, 200 Byzantine and post-Byzantine steatite icons that were catalogued by Jolly Calabrezu-McSainer. As she told me last April when we were discussing these objects at Dumbarton Oaks, this scale matters. This is a really very big, very large steatite icon. Because a steatite is a fragile material prone to impurities and fractures. The extraction of a stone block of this size and relatively homogeneity implies significant economic investment and access to specialized craftsmanship. This alone suggests a prestigious commission and distinguishes the object from the vast majority of steatite icons, which were small, portable, and designed for private devotion. In fact, this icon was likely conceived for a more complex use, probably within a semi-public or liturgical context. Well, from an iconographic perspective, the representation of the complete dodecaorton on a single steatite panel is extraordinarily rare. Most steatite icons break the cycle into separate plaques. Only 3 closely comparable examples are known today. One in the V&A, the Victorian Albert Museum, one in the Benaki Museum in Athens, and a fragmentary icon excavated in Kelm, Poland. Thank you very much, Tom Nixon, for pointing me to the article. The Kelm fragments are also particularly important because they were found in a controlled archaeological context, allowing scholars to establish, and this is important, a terminus ante quem for their use by the second half of the 13th century. While this does not date the Toledo icon directly, it confirms that such objects were circulating widely and far beyond Byzantium by this time. Well, the iconographic program draws heavily on apocryphal traditions visible in a sense such as the Nativity, the Crucifixion, and especially the Pentecost. In fact, several iconographic details in the Toledo icon have been described as anomalous. I would argue instead that they are deliberate and meaningful, and that they offer crucial chronological clues. In the nativity scene, for instance, you can see here an elderly hooded figure that appears in the corner, watching the midwife bathing Christ's child, and this figure derives from a visual contamination with the shepherd. But as suggested by Cyril Mango, iconographically, it could represent the devil. In the crucifixion, instead, a semi-nude figure pierced by the crossbeam appears beneath the cross. If it were an object manufactured in the West, as we all know, we would immediately assume that this may be Adam. But this was not, of course, common in the Byzantine tradition. In Byzantium, the most common depiction is that of here in this space, is the classical god Hades, personified according to the Gospel of Nicodemus, that is, lamenting the disturbance in his belly as Christ descends into hell. Yet, the youthful appearance of this figure might indicate that he is indeed Adam. Well, at any case, these two apocryphal references point to a learned environment deeply engaged with theological narrative rather than with rigid canonical formulas. Another one iconographic detail, in this case in the scene of the Pentecost here, is especially significant for chronology. At its center appears a figure enclosed with a small architectural structure holding a scroll. This figure represents cosmos, the world, an allegory that becomes fully codified only from the second half of the 12th century onwards. So the presence of cosmos in the Toledo icon also aligns the icon with a sophisticated theological reading of the second chapter of the Acts of the Apostles. Then, stylistically speaking, there's a confirmation of chronology because we can relate the visual vocabulary of this sort of carving with contemporary Byzantine manuscript illumination. More specifically, it resonates with what you have here, the miniatures associated with the Byzantine master of Kokkinobafos. And these manuscripts associated with the master of Kokkinobafos illustrate Marian homilies inspired by apocryphal sources, especially the Proto-Evangelium of James, and they privilege this more narrative dynamism. Well, the icon entered the historiographical record in 1892 on the occasion of the Exposición Histórica Europea held in Madrid. It was selected among 54 objects intended to represent the historical richness of Toledo's treasury. The Catalan description is brief but revealing because it describes the icon as a cuadro, meaning in English as a picture. At first glance, this description appears neutral, yet the term cuadro is revealing because it reflects a transformation the object had already undergone. And you can see the transformation here. By the late 19th century, the icon had been screwed onto a wooden frame. This act, seemingly innocuous, fundamentally altered how the object was perceived. And this intervention transformed the object visually and conceptually. A major turning point, in the study of these objects came then in 2022 during a fieldwork campaign I did in Toledo Cathedral. For much of its modern history, the reverse of the icon remained invisible. But this changed precisely in 2022 when I was given a special permission. The icon then was temporarily removed from its 19th century frame, and its reverse could finally be examined for the first time in over a century, which was, to my opinion, very important. On the reverse, you can see it here, we can observe two distinct types of marks. There are marks that are characteristic of the practice incisions made usually by carvers. And second, some of the deeper marks were deliberately created in order to roughen the surface, thus allowing the reverse to be attached with adhesive to some form of mounting or frame. My examination of the icon's reverse also revealed, and this is super important, you would see it very clearly in here, an unpublished inscription, not in Greek, but in Latin, which was scratched directly into the stone surface of the reverse. It is written in Romans, you have it here. I'm sorry, it's super difficult to see it with all this scratching, but you have it here. And it was written in Romance vernacular using a cursive Gothic script consistent with late medieval Castilian documentary heads. The execution is informal and functional rather than calligraphic, suggesting a practical purpose rather than a commemorative or devotional one. Because all of the other marks of the reverse, at some point, reading the inscription became almost a nightmare. As such, I asked for help to several colleagues, among them Julian Luxford, who is also here. Thank you very much for your comments and remarks. And as you can see here, the text reads, I'm translating directly into English. So the same 5 ducats, 57 maravedis, and 1 cornado. Therefore, I'm finishing. Therefore, the text records a quantified value expressed in 3 different currencies, that is, in ducats, maravedis, and cornados. This inscription fundamentally altered my understanding of the object. The choice to inscribe this information directly onto the object is highly significant. It implies that the icon itself functioned, at least at one moment in its life, as a unit of economic value, that is, as an asset that needed to be identified, assessed, and possibly circulated independently of written registers. Well, the combination of these 3 currencies, ducats, maravedis, and cornados, is also crucial for establishing the chronology of the inscription. Cornados were low-denomination copper or vellon coins minted in Castile from the early 15th century onwards. Their production ceased during the reign of Henry IV around 1474. Maravedis were primarily used as units of account to express fractions of higher denomination coins, such as ducats. And ducats, by contrast, originated in Venice and became the dominant gold currency of Mediterranean trade. In the Iberian Peninsula, their adoption was gradual and uneven. In the Crown of Aragon, for instance, they began to be minted between 1475 and 1477 under King John II. This overlap is important because it allows us to establish a terminus antiquum of 1474 for the inscription. By extension, 1474 could also be a terminus antiquum for the presence of the icon in Castile and possibly in Toledo. Remember that cornados were specifically a Castilian coin. Well, the linguistic form used in the inscription, ducati, rather than the Castilian ducados, is especially revealing also because it reflects an Italianate or international commercial register. suggesting familiarity with the Mediterranean mercantile practices rather than a strictly local monetary language. In Castile, the widespread and official use of ducats was only formalized in 1497 with the legal corpus known as Pragmática de Medina del Campo. However, ducats circulated in commercial and accounting texts well before their formal adoption, particularly in environments connected to Mediterranean exchange or networks. Well, equally important, and I'm about to finish, I promise, is what the inscription does not represent. Because when I first encountered the inscription, my first thought was that it was a purchase note. Wow, right? It is not a purchase record. Such inscriptions are virtually unknown in the documentary culture of Toledo Cathedral, and acquisitions were recorded in account books or charters, not scratched onto objects. So if someone here knows about any medieval object which proves otherwise, please tell me, because that would be very helpful. Instead, the inscription should be understood as a valuation, an estimated worth assigned to the object at a specific moment. This practice is well documented in cathedral treasuries, particularly in contexts where objects were pledged as collateral, loaned temporarily, or transferred for use outside the main treasury. Well, my suspicion is that the inscription should be understood as a recognition of the precious metal's value. So, and I'm not turned crazy, so the question that arises is, what metal I am talking about when considering an steatite icon? Well, I have already mentioned the marks on the reverse that were thought for the icon to be attached to a frame. What sort of frame? So, this sort of frame you can see here. We know that some steatite icons were attached to wooden frames, and in turn, these wooden frames were normally coated with silver. As such, it is my suspicion that the inscription should be understood as a recognition of the value given by a missing original silver frame. As it has been very well studied by Alison Estialou, inventories of sacred treasuries also functioned as tracking records. Weighing objects with significant precious metal content was an efficient method of calculating their financial value. This was a practice underscored by the fact that most entries of weight in inventories appear in the local unit of account. It was an efficient method of estimating the amount of metal that could be extracted from a given item, or in this case, the amount of silver that had been extracted from the icon. Consequently, the original silver frame of the steatite icon, as it happened with many other missing metal frames, was probably melted and thus recycled. Well, this interpretation aligns closely with the inventory practices of Toledo Cathedral analyzed by Tom Nixon. His work, which was already partially published in his splendid book on Toledo Cathedral, and which would be also expanded in a chapter that is about to be published, his work published and analyzed some inventories, each of them responding to different administrative needs. Some inventories listed objects permanently stored in the treasury, others recorded items assigned to specific liturgical functions, others still documented goods temporarily transferred to the personal chapels of archbishops or used as warranties collateral in financial operations. Well, in several 15th century inventories, I know, just for a minute. In several 15, I'm so sorry. My last paragraph. In several 15th century inventories, marginal notes record the estimated value of objects, not as market prices, but as a record of the metal's weight. In this regard, particularly illuminating are the inventories from Toledo Cathedral associated with two treasuries, Pedro González de Soria and Alfonso Martínez, in the early 15th century. In their marginal notes, they recorded the weight of the metals of different objects, and these weights were expressed in the currencies of the moment. Well, for now, I know that all of this might raise a lot of questions, but in my mind, it's like, I like to think that if John McNeill was here, he would say, maybe once again, very interesting, very So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Ron, have you still got the
microphone, yeah.
yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's fine. Okay. If you want to introduce the whilst I get this on.
Well, we're a bit behindhand, so we'll move on immediately and to the next paper by Rosa Bacile. She's an independent scholar. She was co-editor with John McNeill of Romanesque and the Mediterranean, 2005, to which she contributed a paper on the porphyry workshop in Norman Palermo. She's also written other papers on Norman architecture in southern Italy and Sicily. Today she's speaking on the use of spolia in the Abbey of the Santissima Trinita at Venosa, 11th to 12th century. Rosa.
I'll be very fast.
Yeah.
Shall I open it?
Yeah, shall we? Now, wave a red thing at you if you're ever running.
I'm not the time. Can anyone hear me? Yeah, is that okay? And I just wanted to thank Richard first for inviting me. And I wrote this paper, I think it was 15 years ago. So it's mostly like out of date. I was helped by John McNeill greatly, so I thought it was a good match, a good way of presenting it. And I had looked at some new bibliography, and there is no match in the topic, so it's definitely unpopular. So updated and unpopular, but it will be short. So this is the Santissima Trinita of Venosa, and we call this like the minor church. And also I wanted to point, if there is the stick, to where Venosa is, and it's around here, very close to Melfi, Benevento. Rome is a bit far, but Bari and it's not far. So it's this area, and Venosa is not here, but it's not very far from there as well. Perfect. So the main topic of this paper will be Robert Guiscard, the popular Norman lord who around the 11th century kicked off the conquest of south of Italy. One of the sons of Tancred of Hauteville from his second wife, the Guiscard traveled to south of Italy with his brothers and a small entourage of Norman knights, driven by an unstoppable ambition to acquire new lands. He will go on founding the dynasty of the Norman kings of Sicily, who ruled Sicily and south of Italy for nearly the whole of the 12th century. And this is the family tree. You can see Robert is the first son of the second wife of Tancred, and his brother Roger will continue the dynasty of what we know is the king of Sicily. While conquering the south of Italy, the Norman rulers founded a string of Benedictine abbeys in Apulia, Basilicata, and Calabria. Among those is the Santissima Trinita. The abbey comprises an older building, usually referred to as the minor church, which is the smaller one in the plan, and an unfinished, much larger building, which is referred as incompiuta, so unfinished. The incompiuta is built by using local Roman spolia. In here, we will interrogate the reuse of this spolia in the north transept, so in this area of the building, and the possible understanding of this material by the Benedictine monastic community of the Abbey and the Norman patrons, and whether this material played a role in promoting the memory of the Hauteville family within the contemporary monastic community and maybe even the population of Venosa at large. It's clear that the spolia reused in the Abbey was local to the Abbey itself, and the Roman sites surrounding the Abbey acted as nothing else than stockpile of material when the Abbey was built. This is a recurring process. And I don't know if you can see it, but it's the Roman head of Nero. And this was This is the 6th century's early basilica. So it's underneath what the Trinita we now see. So it's a 6th century. So even in the 6th century, this spolia was used just for building material. And this is now is being rescued in the Museum of Venosa. So it's a very important head, actually. However, around the 11th century, we see the patrons and monastic community of Venosa display a new appreciation of this material and in its role promoting the memory of the Hauteville family. First, a bit about Venosa itself. It was named Venusia by the Romans. It was founded and became an important Roman center following the fall of Taranto and the founding of Brindisi in 1272 BC. Venusia is still well known today as the native place of Horace, born in Venosa in 65 BC. Venusia became popular and a thriving center in Roman times for the pivotal role it played around the Appia Road. Sorry, so it gives the Appia Road is there, and it basically went to Taranto and eventually went to Brindisi. There is another road that would go from Venusia to Bari and then again to Brindisi. This is a very long road, and it's the road that Horace took when he traveled around the Puglia. So we know about this road from the travels of Horace. Okay. And Cicero speaks highly of Venusia as a resting place on his way from Brindisi. He also took that road around 51 BC. And he himself owned a villa in the area from where some of his epistles are addressed. Perfect. And the rest of magnificent villas are found around the countryside of Venosa. So while the city was a very important Roman center, it's the countryside around Venosa which has these magnificent villas where mosaic have been found, and this incredible sarcophagus from which is now in Melfi, but belonged to a very important family of Venosa. And this is another one which is now in Naples. By the 90 BC, Venusia entered the Roman state, and its inhabitants were recognized as Roman citizens, the so-called libertini, freedmen. From recent excavation just outside the city walls of Venosa, we now know there was an amphitheater, and I hope you can see it. So this is an amphitheater, but it's also been defined as an arena. So there were kind of tournaments played there. Then there is a bath complex there, and this is a residential complex. And a baptistry was founded around the 5th century, and Trinita is just there. So you can see here, basically, is the whole road that will connect the amphitheater directly to the baptistry, to the 5th century baptistry, and to the Trinita as well. And around the 5th and 6th century, this just became a necropolis. It's not very important, but it's there's no sarcophagi found in this area, but it's a kind of like it's just like a necropolis underneath this all this area. So this is the area before the excavation. So you can see the baptistry, but nothing else. And this is how it looks after. And now I think they've excavated even much more. So this is the plan of the baptistry, which we don't know much about it really. And this is the early Christian basilica underneath the Trinita, which now you can see the remains if you go and visit the church. And the head of Nero, I think, was found around there. But then this shows the necropolis again, and this is the necropolis just underneath the church. Perfect, and finally we get to the minor church. The minor church was first founded by Drogo, older brother of Robert Guiscard. He died in 1051. Drogo's successor, his younger brother Humphrey, would die in 1057 and would name as his successor Robert Guiscard. In 1059, in Melfi, Pope Nicholas II granted both Venosa and Melfi to Robert Guiscard, who, thanks to the papal backing, became the most important overlord in the south, gaining the title of Duke of Apulia. Ordericus Vitalis tells us a lot about Venosa, and he says that Robert appointed Berengar, a monk from Saint-Evroul's in South Normandy, as abbot of Venosa. Robert Guiscard granted a great number of privileges to the abbey. Both the Guiscard and Astell abbot. So this is the map. And Astell abbot are believed to be the commissioner and the patrons of the new refurbishment of the abbey. It's also around this time that we hear of the translation of the relics of the martyrs of the three brothers, Senatore, Viatore, Cassiodoro, and the Armada Dominata from San Marco Argentano in Cosenza to Venosa, and the arrival of two relics of St. Nicholas of Myra. In 1069, Robert Guiscard also arranged to have his elder half-brothers were buried at Venosa, having them translated from diversi Apuli loges. Thus, Venosa effectively was transformed into a family mausoleum, as the Norman conquest of Apulia was nearing completion at the behest of the Guiscard. The existing medieval sources only mention four Hauteville brothers by name: Humphrey, Drogo, William, and Robert Guiscard himself, to have been buried in Venosa. Some non-completely reliable sources also mention William Harron-Arm, but this has not been proved by any other sources, so it's been dismissed as possible. Robert Guiscard himself died on the island of Cefalonia on 17th of July, 1085. The medieval chronicle of William of Apulia, who wrote the Gesta of Robert Guiscard, tells us the city of Venosa is made resplendent by such burial. Since the time of Charlemagne and Caesar, never had the earth produced such brothers as this. They are buried in the church built on the Ordas, the beauty of which illuminated the town. May the heavenly King, 3 and 1, give pardon to them. Unfortunately, the nature and even the precise location of these early burials elude us. There is no evidence to suggest they were monumental structure, and we don't know where they were located and precisely in which building. We only know that as late as 1560, the rest of the Norman rulers were moving into this Arcosolio, and nothing else about the tombs that we can connect to the medieval dukes. So unfortunately, we have no other evidence. So we'll go back to the Santissima Trinita, to the Incompiuta and the Spolia. All the stones blocked using the Incompiuta were repurposed for the Roman amphitheater. How do we know this? Apart from the a priori assumption that this great quantity of material could only have come from the nearby amphitheater, which has been left bare of any stone blocks, there is some specific evidence that points to the amphitheater as the source of the material. Two stone slabs used in the left transept, one on the interior on top of the doorway, and one on the side of the doorway, bear some inscription. One is this, and one is this. So basically, when you come in from the door, one is on top of you, and one is on the side. Yeah, this is one. The slab describes a family of gladiators and a long list of gladiators. The inscription clearly says the slab was placed by the family of Salvi Capitonis, who was a very wealthy figure in Imperial Venosa. The Salvi Capitonis family dealt in the wool industry in Venosa, but also had important government positions. Historians have agreed that the wealthy Roman family must have expanded their business interests and at some point invested in the entertainment business and on to teams of gladiator and financially supported tournaments. The two slabs have been at the center of historical debates for years. It's been concluded by Todisco and Lachenal that the slab report the names of the gladiator that either died during competition and praised the family of Salvi Capitonis for their support. The slab must have originally adorned the family tombs of the Capitonis or the amphitheater, and they were probably found in the amphitheater and brought as material to Venosa. Turning back to the north transect, from the exterior on top of the doorway, a Roman funerary niche that had been between the end of the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD has also been reused. This measured 91 by 158, inserted at 4 meters high from the ground. The tympano, which you can see it here, represents a Medusa, and we don't know whether, I think we know they are not part of the same, only they're actually two pieces, distinct pieces of, so the niche and the tympano, they don't go together. The burial slabs represent two couples, two togati men following the fashion of Imperial Rome. They must have originally held scrolls on their right hands. The left hand is holding the toga following standardized rules of representation from the time. The holding of the scrolls and the toga indicate these men were definitely free men, they were libertini, and must have held important administrative role or were part of a gilded profession or a wealthy trade. The women wear tunics, and one of them in the Pulicita position, while the second one, right, must have held a scroll as well. So it's been argued that the one in Pulicita position, which is on the left, she was probably still a slave, while the other one was definitely a free woman. Historian Todisco, who has extensively worked on this material, argued that this slab and the two epigraphical slabs of the gladiator would indeed come from the same burial complex and may all belong to the tomb of the Salvi Capitonis family, but very difficult to say if this was the case. From the outside of this doorway is visible on the northeastern wall of the transept another burial relief slab. This is also Roman, so the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. It measures 68 by 190 and it stands at 6 meters, so it's much higher. Yeah, you can see it there. 4 figures again are represented in this slab, 3 male and 1 female. The 3 male are togati as per standard fashion, and their right arm molded the toga. The only female figure has a hand in their shoulder and also wears a tunic. And this is the Cinna family. It's a family of a very popular council in Venosa. So we know of this family from other archaeological sources. So this is their kind of portraits, really. Perfect, you can see it again. Okay. These relief slabs were produced in Rome, north of Italy, and Basilicata and Campania from the Republican Empire era. In the south of Italy, they can be found in Venosa, Menfi, Benevento, and Capua, and then be grouped and defined as the funerary reliefs of the Roman freedmen, so-called libertini. After the death of Augustus, these monuments were rarely manufactured. Most of them are bust lengths. Sometimes they comprise up to 6 people. Most commonly, they represent 3 or 4 figures. They generally emphasize the virtues of Romanitas and the unity of the family, central theme of Roman society in the early empire. They usually bear a description, an epitaph, a very simple description of the deceased and his family, who might still be alive. The slabs are never freestanding and usually decorate the facade of burial monuments or columbarium. So I just put some other examples from Capua. So these are very common. You find them everywhere in south of Italy. And I think John McNeill was very keen to look at those because they are in kind of like in a lot of Norman churches reuses them. While in the early Republican era, Roman slaves' burials were included in the burial complex of their patrons, following the emancipation from slavery in places like Venosa, we witness a rise of burial monuments dedicated to the new class of Roman citizens. These reliefs do not always represent the family. Sometimes they also represent a group of friends from the same guild or profession, bakers, doctors, architects. As strange as this might seem, this is due to the fact that the Libertini had no genealogy and no ancestry. When becoming slaves, they had been stripped of any attachment to their biological family, their master family now being their only family. Once liberated, the freedmen wanted to celebrate their family rights, although they would still never have access to their biological ancestor. Their children acquired the right to use their name as surname, while they would keep their master name as their surname. The burial monument reflects this new status. This is why family portraits usually represent siblings, parents, and their children, but never grandparents or ancestors. The slab positioned in this very crucial location in the exterior and interior of the transept of the incompiuta and being described as commemorating the Norman brothers who were buried in Venosa. It's crucial to represent 4 figures as the 4 Norman brothers buried in Venosa. Although the slabs represent women, and it's impossible to ascertain if a connection to the Norman brother could be drawn in the 11th century. If not to commemorate the Norman brothers, why would the patron and monastic community choose to have the portraits of Roman families in their sanctuary and transept doorway? A reconstruction of the whole doorway might give some hint to the significance of these panels. Thanks to a 16th century description of Venosa, we know by Cappellano, we know that these were already in place in the 16th century. So it's a very late date, but it's the only date that we know for sure they were already there. All architectural historians dealing with the incompiuta believe this panel belonged to the first building phase of the incompiuta around the 11th century. A reconstruction of the possible completed doorway sees close comparison to the doorway of Bari Cathedral from 1089. So this is the doorway of Venosa has been reconstructed and compared to Bari to make sure, just to state that this was definitely 11th century. I don't believe it much, but okay. However, it looks like the doorway and the stones block are not uniform like the rest of the building, so we can't completely be certain of its dating. The slab in the interior north transept seemed to be original to the first design. So when we look at the first one, sorry, it's very much, it's not been moved much, so people think this must be part of the original design. While if we look at this other slab, I'm done. While we look at the other slab, we can see that it's not centered to the axis of the door. So they might have been arranged at some point, but we don't know when. Most architectural historians have argued that there is no alternative to the 11th century, as it must have been Robert Guiscard who wanted slabs inserted in the Abbey. However, the Norman family would be commemorated in the Abbey for centuries to come. In the 12th century, when a new abbot, Egidio, close to the court of Palermo, would revamp the Abbey in the memory of his founder, he also remembered the saints which were buried in Venosa, which were venerated in Venosa. These were the brothers Cassiodorus, Senatoris, Viatoris, and their mother Dominata, which had been moved to Venosa from Calabria. The convolute passion of martyrdom of this family of four, arriving from Palestine and Calabria, was written in Monte Cassino in the 11th century. The story is believed to have been concocted in the Middle Ages. There are surviving versions both in Greek and Latin, and these martyr saints played a crucial role in the liturgy of the Abbey of Venosa and in the Cappella Palatina of Palermo too. So it's possible to link the Roman family portraits also to the cult of the three martyrs and their mother. Furthermore, from a manuscript from Venosa, dated indeed to the end of the 12th century and linked to the abbot Egidio, we learn the monks witness a number of apparitions of Robert Guiscard processing inside the abbey, followed by two abbots and three saints, believed to be indeed Cassiodorus, Viatoris, and Senatoris. In the apparition, the Guiscard stood by the sanctuary where the relics of the three brothers and their mother Dominata were kept, and reproached the monk for dilapidating the treasury of the abbey. The Norman Duke then remarked how the three saints will protect the abbey. By 1181, the Abbey of Venosa had plunged into a profound crisis. It would suffer even further under the Hohenstaufen ruler for the remainder of the 12th and 13th century until its dissolution in 1267. Thus, the late 12th century seems to be the only other possible moment for a revamp of the doorway or a relay. Be that as it may, we probably never know with certainty when these panels were inserted within the walls of the abbey. The panel must have appealed either to the Norman rulers or the later community of Venosa by simply telling a story of an uncommon family group, and also of the famous families of Venosa, the freedmen, Salvi Capitoni's family with their gladiators, the Cinna family, the Norman brothers, and the Martyrs brothers venerated in Venosa. They commemorated the Norman brothers who had settled in a new land and were promoted to a new leading status, and whose their intrigues, loyalty, and disloyalty will characterize the Kingdom of Sicily for the whole 12th century. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for making your way back here so promptly after a slightly curtailed
speakers.
coffee break.
Angry Richard. Make sure you keep to time.
Exactly. So welcome back to this short session before lunch. In it, our speakers will be leading us gently into the medieval scriptorium to introduce us to two very different medieval manuscripts. So I hope you've all got your white gloves ready. Both speakers will, I think, probably already be known to most of you through their roles within the BAA. Róisín Astell has been nobly fulfilling, as you've all seen over the last few days, the traditional BAA conference role of wrestling the IT into submission, but she's also our current communications officer. She recently completed her PhD on learning and seeing in English and French late 13th and early 14th century manuscripts at the University of Kent. But she's very much on home ground here today, as she previously completed her master's thesis here in Oxford. She takes directly one of the themes of this conference in her paper this morning on gendered boundaries, women as Antithesis and Exemplar in an early 14th century English illuminated manuscript. Thank you, Róisín.
Yeah, I'm going to figure this out. I've got a high neck, so I should be able to. Can everybody hear me? Okay, I might just hold it, Thank you so much for that introduction, Heather. Yeah, I do apologise for this photo. It's the last photo I had of John, and I think it just speaks volumes of his fashionable taste here. And I do think Julian would like to do a caption this competition, so he'll let you know what the prize will be. But this was taken in October 2024, so this was the last time I saw John in person. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for asking me to be here. I'm honoured to be presenting in memory of him. And I actually owe much of my presence here and involvement in the BAA because of John. I first met him at the beginning of my PhD. I think it was at the Poitiers conference. And, as a student starting out, he and everybody here in this room was very welcoming to me. But John had this kind of really unique way of being incredibly approachable. He definitely was a pillar of the association. He was always kind. He was always ready to listen. And whenever I came to him with new ideas, he was genuinely enthusiastic and supportive, but also then gave me lots more jobs to do. So thanks, John. And so sometimes I still have this impulse to think, oh gosh, I should ask John about this, or oh, John would know this, and you think, oh gosh, okay. But today, what I'm presenting today is actually very different to what John did his research on. But the images I'm going to be looking at today, I'm going to argue, served as guides for the medieval readers. And as I was preparing for this paper, I realized this could be a fitting tribute to him, who was this guide and a source for myself, but also many others here, but also young scholars as well. So I'm going to be dedicating to this paper to him. And in the spirit of guidance in mind, I'm going to begin moving on to my discussion of this manuscript. So as someone who's been helping with the tech, can she use it? Yes, she can. Yay, she can. Wonderful. So there we go. So executed at the beginning of the 14th century, the enormous and lavishly illuminated Wells Apocalypse offers a rare insight into devotional and gendered visual culture of early century England. Today, I will be focusing on a deceptively small element of this decorative program, the head initials, which is what I wrote my whole PhD thesis on, and you'd think I'd be trying to get away from it, but here I am again talking about them. And in this manuscript, we have 83 isolated human heads appearing throughout the manuscript, positioned beside the Anglo-Norman text, the Lumière Allée, and the prose Apocalypse and its gloss. Long dismissed as minor decoration, these initials are in fact integral to the manuscript's didactic design. I will focus today on 3 iconographic types of women, showing how they perform exegetical and moral work, training their viewers to judge correctly at the boundaries between virtue and vice. But before turning to the imagery itself, it is important to consider the manuscript's provenance. Scholars following Donald Drew Egbert date the manuscripts to between 1300 and 1320 on stylistic grounds. But in 1910, George Warner of the British Museum then proposed a Greenfield Priory origin in Lincolnshire. Now, it doesn't exist anymore, except it's right by this dirt track. So I'm proposing to Sophie Kelly that our next study day will be a trip to this dirt track. I'll leave that up to you to organise. So it doesn't exist anymore. And his reasoning behind this provenance was because of some fly leaves in the back of the manuscript written in the 15th century, which includes a list of books and a list of woods, and one of those woods being the Greenfield Priory wood here. So that's why he thinks there's a connection. However, Egbert in 1940 rejects this provenance, and he says, actually, because this writing is in the 15th century, it must mean that the manuscript was in the hands of a lay person or a lay family before the dissolution of the priory. So Egbert says, actually, I think one of the patrons might have been Adam Wells, Sir Adam Wells at the top here, or perhaps his sons, Robert or Adam, as the likely patrons. And these figures, they were figures of wealth, had courtly connections, and were known for their religious patronage. However, Egbert and scholars since have overlooked the devotional world of the Wells women. And here you can see on the screen, so Sir Adam's two daughters, Margaret and Cecilia, were actually nuns at the nearby Cistercian Abbey of Greenfield Priory. Margaret served as a prioress between 1331 and 1349, and there are several members of the Wells family buried at the Greenfield Priory, and those little crosses next to some of the names are the ones that are buried there. So we know from wills that Sir Adam, the big father at the top, patronised a chapel dedicated to the Virgin Mary at Greenfield Priory. And he also supported the election of the prioresses there. So whether the manuscript was commissioned for the sisters' instruction, for communal reading within a priory, or perhaps a book through which the nuns educated their lay patrons, its content and visual programme align closely with this Wells Greenfield devotional context. The contents and physical form of the manuscript reinforce this. The pairing of two substantial vernacular works, the Lumière Allée and the illustrated prose Apocalypse, is almost unique. The Lumière was composed in around 1270s as a didactic dialogue explaining Christian doctrine for lay and religious readers who were seeking moral and intellectual guidance. The prose Apocalypse, with its extensive vernacular gloss, provided insight into St. John's visionary journey. Together, these texts form a manuscript of considerable intellectual ambition, perhaps suited to a Cistercian female community under aristocratic patronage or a noble household invested in vernacular theology. And also, the book's scale and size, I think, confirms this communal use. It measures roughly around 45 to 30 centimetres and is far larger than any other contemporary illuminated apocalypses. And it's too heavy for private handling, so it must have been read on a lectern. And when I took this photo, you can see it's quite big, and we had two of us having to take it off the trolley at the British Library onto the reader here. So I can't imagine somebody would sit with this on their lap because they probably would have bruised knees from that. And also, one thing that's really interesting about this manuscript is that it's almost nearly pristine. There's no darkened margins or devotional wear. And this supports the idea that likely supervised collective reading rather than intimate haptic use was how this manuscript functioned. And again, this aligns perhaps with the context in which the book was meant to be seen, read aloud, and contemplated as communal devotion. Although we have no heraldry to confirm this original ownership, the evidence points to a shared devotional sphere in which aristocratic patronage and religious female life were intertwined. The Wells family shaped the spiritual life of Greenfield Priory, while the nuns' learning and piety enhanced their devotional identity within the family and wider circles. Within this world, aristocratic, female, and pedagogical, the manuscript's imagery, especially its female head initials, must be understood. So, throughout the manuscript, the head initials reveal how these images were used to structure moral perception. 62 depict men, and Kelsey's only 21 are women. Yet, the women appear precisely where the text is morally charged, where questions of virtue, temptation, spiritual authority, and eschatological judgment arise. And these fall into two main iconographic types. We have modest women who wear white veils and women in ornate headdresses. And I believe that their distribution throughout the manuscript is deliberate. In the Wells Apocalypse, gender is not merely represented. It is a framework through which the manuscript trains the viewers to interpret bodies, regulate desire, and discern moral truth. The women become the figures through which correct and incorrect forms of seeing, behaving, and believing are defined. So, drawing on Madeline Cavanagh's work on clothing and identity politics, today I argue that these female head initials function as active tools for instruction. Their headdresses and garments operate as socially intelligible signs, encoding virtue, status, and spiritual alignment. For medieval readers, what a woman wore was not decorative, but also morally communicative. The Wells Apocalypse Illuminator harnesses the visual language to teach its users, likely including these female religious women at Greenfield, how to see, how to judge, and how to understand female embodiment as a site of theological meaning. Oh, there we go. So this first iconographic type I want to examine here are the women with the white veils. Of 21 of the female head initials in the manuscript, 15 show women wearing this simple white veil draped over their head and shoulders. That's not an advertisement, by the way, for the shampoo. Whoa. The meaning of this image would have been immediately legible to medieval viewers. Drawing on St. Paul's instruction that women should veil their heads while in prayer, the veil became both a religious marker of piety and a social marker of married respectability. As historian Catherine French notes, it signified controlled sexuality and modest behavior. By contrast, unmarried girls did not generally cover their hair, and sex workers were frequently forbidden to wear veils. Therefore, to depict a woman wearing a veil was to signal virtue and moral reliability. And this context helps us to understand the veiled head initial on folio 20 verso. And this opens a key passage of the Lumiere. Here, the student asks his master who sinned more, Adam or Eve. The master replies, of course, that it was Eve's nature as a woman that meant that she was weaker and more likely to be influenced. Adam, he claimed, sinned only out of pity and loyalty, hoping God would not let Eve perish. Oh, what a great guy. And this framing, drawn from Peter Lombard and Thomas Aquinas, shifts the moral weight again onto almost entirely Eve. Now, the Lumiere deepens this by explaining that the devil tempted Eve in the guise of a woman with, quote, the head of a virgin and the serpentine form below, end quote. And this weaponization is visually evident in the temptation miniature of the Wells Apocalypse, where the serpent is depicted not as a virgin, but as a married woman, identified by this padded, netted headpiece, similar to those worn by others in the manuscript. Yeah, here we go. Here's an example. This style was normally signified respectable maturity, but it's here used to mask deception. For medieval viewers, this may have been unsettling. A familiar emblem of modesty becomes the devil's disguise. The image warns that temptation can inhabit even socially approved forms. Against this, the head initial on folio 20 verso works as a deliberate counter-image to Eve. While Eve is shown elsewhere in the manuscript with long, loose hair, a visual shorthand for youthful sexuality or maybe transgression, the veiled woman here on folio 20V models this disciplined, honorable restraint. Medieval viewers understood unbound hair as a sign of moral disorder. For example, historian Paul Newman remarks that an older woman appearing in public with uncovered hair was effectively declaring their loose morals. So maybe I should wear your hat, Richard, just to put a signal out there. No, I'm fine. So the Wells Apocalypse Illuminator exploits this opposition. Uncovered hair marks the collapse of order after the fall, while the white veil embodies this restoration. And again, we have connections to images of the Virgin Mary wearing the white veil, so just to kind of add to this. So this white veil head initial, therefore, does more than introduce a chapter. It visually codifies the expectations of moral conduct, respectable self-presentation, and disciplined sight. It instructs the viewers, nuns and aristocratic laywomen alike, how to interpret female behavior and how to regulate their own. The veil also functions simultaneously as a literal covering and a moral boundary, signaling the disciplined body and the rejection of sinful desire. In this way, the veiled woman becomes a corrective to Eve, teaching viewers to move beyond superficial appearances and instead to scrutinize bodies and their own vision. So, if this woman, or the veiled woman, visualizes modesty and disciplined vision in the manuscript, the women shown with ornate headdresses expose the opposite problem, the moral instability of display. And this is the second iconographic type I want us to have a look at today. women whose fashionable headwear signals the risk of luxury and misdirected sight. And this is a striking example found in the manuscript, and she appears with the gloss opening Revelation chapter 17, which we all know is about the Whore of Babylon. She wears a turquoise crespine, a costly lattice-work hairnet associated with courtly women of high status. Often made from silk and metal, and studded with pearls, the crespine was a recognizable marker of aristocratic fashion. In the Wells Apocalypse, you can see here, the tiny white dots likely represent these embellishments. Although she is the only initial wearing such a headdress, the manuscript repeats the motive in the images of the Whore of Babylon alongside this chapter, who appears twice wearing a golden version of the same headdress. In this first miniature here, the Whore of Babylon rides a seven-headed beast, dressed in scarlet and lifting her golden chalice, a direct visualization of the quote, full of her abomination and filthiness of her fornication, end quote. And how scary does she look? In the second image, she sits calmly between John and the angel. The mound beneath her alludes to the beast's seven heads and understood in medieval exegesis as Rome's seven hills and its political powers. By seating her on this mound, the Illuminator emphasizes the political power that supports her deception. In both of these images, although I've cropped it out, so sorry about that, John and the angel avert their gaze from her, modeling the discipline of vision that the manuscript expects from its readers. To refuse the seductress's gaze is to already resist her power. And the golden crespine here is critical. It domesticates an apocalyptic figure into the familiar appearance of an elegant medieval woman, someone a viewer might recognize in their own household or court. Just as the devil appears in the guise of a woman in The Temptation, the whore's fashionable headdress warns the temptation often comes clothed in respectability. The crespine even mirrors the halos of John and the angel, heightening this ambiguity. Splendor can mimic sanctity. And this motif holds strong theological weight. Medieval commentators, including Anselm of Laon, linked the Whore of Babylon to the vice of luxuria, aka lust. Anselm argued that her splendor deceives by offering a counterfeit illumination, a sensory appeal that leads viewers away from true wisdom. In this light, the richly adorned crespine becomes an emblem of a vice that dazzles before it destroys, giving immortality the appearance of virtue. Pretty scary stuff. Similar imagery appears outside of the apocalypse tradition. In this Parisian copy of Le Somme le Roi at the Fitzwilliam Museum, the personification of lust appears again with a golden crespine. In this example here on the screen, lust is spitting out blood, which visualizes the belief that excess blood inflames erotic appetite. Now, if we go back to the Wells gloss beside this turquoise head initial, this interprets the whore's drunkenness as a sign of divine vengeance, both on the tyrants who shed Christian blood and on those consumed by lust. This headpiece, therefore, becomes almost like a shorthand for excess, deception, and moral danger. And this visual language continues to be widespread. In this illuminated example of the Anglo-Norman poem Le Mariage de 9 filles du diable, the devil's daughters, which are personifications of the vices, all wear turquoise crespines, and obviously they have their little things. I've completely forgotten what they're called. Horns, thank you very much. I knew I was going to have some audience participation at some point. And the daughter representing lust in this poem remains unmarried. Cue a sad sigh, because she actually fraternizes with every social order, so she can't get married to just one. And so, again, we have here in this opening image a fashionable accessory becoming a sign of pervasive moral threat. Seen in this context, the Wells Apocalypse artist uses the crespine as a theological device. By giving the Whore of Babylon a golden headdress and echoing it in one single head initial, the Illuminator teaches the viewer to question beautiful facades. The female head initial becomes a moral test. Her elegance compels scrutiny, not admiration. Her resemblance to the whore of Babylon forces viewers to distinguish between modest self-representation and luxurious excess. The manuscript collapses a marker of elite fashion into a lesson on vice, reminding its audience that luxury's appeal can corrupt anyone, and that trained, disciplined seeing was essential for salvation. So the final example I want to offer today is the inverse of this jeweled crespine. On folio 122 verso, a young woman within the C initial has her hair neatly braided and is crowned not with a golden crown, but with a floral chapelet of stylized red rosettes. No other woman in the manuscript is depicted in this way. Her hairstyle and garland evoke early 14th century aristocratic fashions. Floral wreaths were widely associated with noble maidens, courtship, and courtly refinement. And medieval literature, such as the Roman de la Rose, regularly describes young women wearing these floral garlands, making the crown an instantly recognizable sign of elite youthful femininity. But the image is not merely courtly. This young woman opens up to the gloss of chapter 4 of Revelation, verses 9 to 11, where the 24 elders cast their crowns down before the throne of God. Her floral crown visually echoes theirs, raising the question, why not a golden crown and why a floral one? Well, the gloss emphasizes that God's victory over the devil is accomplished through Christ's passion. In this light, her crown may allude to the crown of thorns. Her luscious green garland visually echoes Christ's crown that he wears in this crucifixion miniature of the Pabham Clifford Hours, a manuscript attributed to the same workshop as the Wells Apocalypse. Flowers, unlike metalwork, are fragile and transient. The garland, therefore, visually encodes humility and the relinquishing of earthly honor. Like the elders who return their crowns to God, she embodies a form of devotional piety. And Christian theology further deepens her meaning. Throughout the Middle Ages, virgins were closely associated with crowns. Thomas Aquinas writes that there were 3 crowns of exceptional merit who await martyrs, doctors, and virgins, whose victory over the flesh earns the highest reward. Aquinas also stresses that the crown is given immediately after death to those who practice charity through virtuous action. A floral crown, rather than a golden one, aligns this young woman with that humble aspiration. She becomes a prompt for the female viewers to pursue their own spiritual victory rather than worldly adornment. Yet the floral garland also signals vulnerability. The ephemeral nature gestures towards the fragility of virginity itself and the moral effort required to preserve it. This was the theme deeply embedded in medieval devotional literature. In the Speculum Virginum, a 12th century instructional treatise for nuns, the text describes paradise as a garden where virtues bloom. Quote, the lily of chastity, the crocus of chastity, and the violet of humility are all there, end quote. The young virgin novice in the treatise, Theodora, is instructed to weave a floral crown as preparation for her mystical marriage to Christ. Her completed wreath becomes the sign of her transformation from virgin to wife, a visible seal of spiritual formation. And this tradition matters here because the floral garland functions as both self-recognition for consecrated women and as an instruction for aristocratic laywomen. In the speculum, even married women and widows may earn a bridal crown through chastity and right devotion. The same theological invitation is extended by this female head initial. It compresses the ideals of the bride of Christ into a single memorable form. Thus, this young woman becomes a visual shorthand for sanctified vision. Her floral crown mirrors the crowns cast down by the elders and evokes the concept of consecratio virginum, the rite in which virgins receive veils and crowns as a symbol of devotion. She crystallizes the idea of sacred beauty and offers a glimpse into the virginal crown promised in heaven. This young woman, therefore, asks the viewer to imitate both her purity as well as the elders' physical worshipping act. In the manuscript, perhaps used within a Cistercian context where nuns were understood as the spouse of Christ, this image may have resonated strongly. It provided a mirror for religious women and a moral exemplar for laywomen. As a didactic instrument, it teaches viewers to see and how to be seen, not through splendor, but through humility. So to conclude, I hope to have shown you that these head initial examples in the Wells Apocalypse are not mere marginal decoration, but structural components of the manuscript's moral architecture. They function as visual exegesis, shaping how the reader encounters the text and, crucially, how they learn to judge. Across the manuscript, women are positioned at the thresholds and boundaries where virtue and vice, orthodoxy and corruption, and chastity and seduction must be distinguished. Through clothing and hairstyles, these figures teach the reader to view the body as signs that communicate moral status and the risks and rewards of certain forms of behavior. In this sense, they become the visual teachers of the manuscript, guiding its audience how to discern sin and virtue through acts of disciplined looking. Whether this book was handled within an aristocratic household or contemplated by the Cistercian nuns at Greenfield Priory, its imagery ultimately demand a trained gaze. Its head initials choreograph how one should see. The modest veiled women models restraint, the ornate woman warns against deceptive splendor, and the crowned virgin embodies sanctified aspiration. Together, they add a profoundly gendered encounter to the manuscript, one that trains a community capable of reading not only scripture, but bodies, signs, and ultimately themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Róisín, although I'm probably not the only one here who's regretting my choice to wear my hair down and loose today. I'd like to welcome to the stage now.
Entirely confused. Not only not an atypical solution here when John was dispensing his wisdom, but also it's genuinely what I'm like. Only 2 minutes ago, Captain Oliver gave me an announcement to give to you, which I almost completely forgot. And it's not a number. How many? 5.
There's 5.
5.
Year 1000 left, and I do not want to carry them back to London because I might get terrible back to brain. So please,
It's just this is
finish me.
Thank you very much, Catherine. My name is Verónica. I'm chairing the first session this afternoon, and it is a unique experience for me to introduce one of my oldest friends, Dr. John Goodall, whom I have never introduced in a conference before. This is an opportunity that may not come around again. However, we'll keep this clean. John, when a Martian invades Earth and says, "What is this strange word polymath that I have read?" John is what we will direct him to. John is interested famously in everything. Among other things, he's the producer of a very slim volume on castles, which one day we'll be able to replicate. He's one of a number of several that are in this room who managed to rescue, rehabilitate late medieval architecture, particularly in Britain, from having been dismissed previously by someone not as latent decadent. John has managed to do this, but particularly, most recently, John will be known to everyone having probably the most powerful job in architectural history anywhere as a mouthpiece, the architectural editor of Country Life magazine. If you want to know truth about anything, you'll get it from John. John also, quite unusually, is I think the only person in this entire conference who's giving a presentation about the fine city in which this conference is taking place. And so without any more ado, I introduce John to talk about Merton College, Oxford.
Jeremy, thank you very much. Is that working? Does that sound very good? Excellent. This conference prompted me to start looking at some of my old photographs of people on my computer, and I came across this of John and Anna in the background with Freddie, their son, just disappearing behind John. I have no idea quite how this photograph was taken, but I feel as though John is presiding over us all in a very immediate way, and it's a memory of a very, very happy afternoon at Iceland. John endlessly and eloquently tried to persuade me to organise a BAA conference in Oxford. And so this talk is a kind of an apology to him because I always just manage to resist. But this is, I suppose, one of the things that I might have spoken about if that conference had happened. So it's slightly odd indeed giving a talk here when we could just all collectively get up and walk down the road and look at Merton. But I hope that after I've done this, you will have, oh, yes, Richard's leaving already. I hope that after I've spoken, you know, it will be possible to go and have a look when you have time. It is such an important building. And yes, I am talking about the north transept, and yes, this is deeply eccentric in a way. I'm showing you this is the structure that I'm talking about, and I'm really just going to talk about the front of it for reasons that will become apparent. But it's eccentric because it's a section of a building which is rightly famous, begun in 1289, this French-inspired chapel interior with the most magnificent stained glass surviving. That glass has been recently studied by Tim Ayres in two enormous Corpus Victriarum volumes of incredible quality. Tim is such a sort of diligent and meticulous scholar of this material, and I'm hardly going to talk about any of the things that he has talked about. But indeed, if you go to Merton, this probably is what you ought to be most interested in. But one of the things I think is very significant to realise about the scholarship of both Oxford and Cambridge, both cities crammed with the most outstanding architecture, is the way in which the architectural history is so often written purely in terms of collegiate histories. There's nothing wrong with this, and indeed I rely on many of these collegiate histories in the way that they investigate their subject for all sorts of material. They're incredibly high quality. But it sometimes feels claustrophobic. It's as though the horizon of these studies really are the walls of the college. And one of the themes indeed that David picked up when he was talking about the Augustinians yesterday is that although today Merton seems like a fixture in the Oxford collegiate world, its origins in the 1260s and 1270s are very nebulous, really. There's a sort of pragmatism about the way in which Walter de Merton gathers together the strands of what's already in existence in Oxford and tries to constitute a college modelled on what has recently been created in the Sorbonne in Paris. Merton, in fact, begins as a dual foundation divided between Surrey and Oxford. It's very, very messy indeed. And this is important to our understanding of the transept. That's because Merton College Chapel is actually constructed immediately beside a parish church, which no longer exists. It's the parish church of St. John. And I'm showing you here a reconstruction of the burgage plots that are brought together by Walter de Merton not by Walter de Merton, by his executors in the 1280s. And you can see St. John's Church here and a visualization of the collegiate chapel just here with a treasury, which is somehow a remodeling of that chapel of St. John. Now, in fact, it's just a little bit more complicated than this diagram shows. Antin has shown the choir, the 13th century choir here, and a tower. But in fact, from the first, it's quite clear, or certainly by 1300, Merton had been laid out, sorry, wrong way, with a transept. I'm showing you here a piscina, which is in the far northeast, well, in fact, inverted the plan, right up in the southeast corner of the chapel. So I hope you can see it's a T-shaped building. This is the north transept we'll be talking about, but right up in the top corner, by let's say 1300, there is definitely a piscina here, and that south transept indeed becomes a lady chapel used by the college. It seems indeed, for a period of time, as though the college chapel is operating immediately beside a parish church, one beside the other. And what's going to happen in the course of the early 14th century is that the parish church is going to be demolished and swallowed wholesale by Merton College Chapel. Now, if you walk along the west side of that T-shaped plan at Merton, you'll see that in fact, by about 1300, both sides of the T-shape must in some form have been laid out. And what's really interesting is that on this west wall, you do have clearly the remains of an aisle, a nave roof, and in fact, there's another aisle arch facing. I had a special scanned survey done of this building, which I'm showing you. Very expensive to do. And I hope you can see that this is the blocked aisle arch. And what is proposed here is a nave that is never built. Now, you could write quite a lot just about this very odd plan, an aisleless choir with a double-aisled nave. It's a form that turns up later in the 15th century in places such as Eton, intended by Henry VI in the 1440s. But it's also a design found in friary churches of the 13th century. So it's quite an unusual plan. I think it's important to say. What this also tells us is that long before this transept is built, or this facade is built, that there is already a part of this T-shaped plan laid out. So just to sort of contextualize this again, here we are. This is what Merton College is supposed to have looked like in about 1300 from the Ordnance Survey maps. And I hope you can see this is the south transept. In fact, some of the north transept must have been laid out, but here's the chapel, and there's St. John's Street, and here's the college with the hall and the warden's lodgings. So what about the transept itself? We know that work on the north transept, the south transept is finished probably by about 1416. And then we know from the fabric accounts of Merton that work progresses to the north transept. We know that the north transept is being glazed in 1425, and it's probably structurally complete by 1419. So there's sort of window 1416 to 1425 for the completion of everything you see. What you're also, I think, importantly seeing in this design is, in fact, the notional west front of a parish church. In other words, this door leading onto the street is taking you into the new chapel or the new parish church of St. John, and that what you're looking at, in fact, is this rather weird thing of a west end twisted northwards. This is the view you get when you walk into Merton today. If you go through that door, you're looking straight across the transepts, and on your left is the choir that I showed you pictures of before. Now, the first thing to say about this north transept design is it is actually pretty ambitious to have, in this period, a 7-light window. That's a big window. One of the things I'm going to be coming back to again and again is the ambition, in fact, relatively, of this north transept window. What's described in the fabric accounts of the glazing as the great north window, on the great north window in the aisle. An interesting term. Just to put this in context, you do get bigger windows at the west end of parish churches. This is the Chapel of Ease at St. Nicholas at King's Lynn, which many of you will know well. Now, that's an 11-window west window. It's pretty amazing. If you go to other college chapels in Oxford, even when they have east windows, this is Lincoln Chapel of the early 17th century. I can see it's a 6-light east window with its original glazing scheme still in place. It's very ambitious relative even to most parish churches and other buildings of this kind. The explanation, I think, for the ambition of Merton is the foundation between its initial establishment and 1379, which is the foundation by William of Wykeham, Richard II's Chancellor of New College, Oxford. Now, famously, and this audience doesn't really need reminding, but William of Wykeham found 2 great educational institutions that are linked together. In 1378, he gets a license from the Pope to establish a college at Winchester, and those scholars are to pass on in 1379 to a university college. Nothing on this scale had ever been attempted before, And William of Wykeham's new collegiate buildings are on an extraordinary scale, directly inspired by the major works that Edward III has undertaken in the upper ward at Windsor Castle, which he also oversaw as a young clerk. This is the west end of New College, and as I'm sure you're all aware, New College has a T-shaped plan, like the upper ward at Windsor. The hall at this end and the chapel are plugged together, but the chapel also has a T-shaped plan. Now, it's almost certainly the case that in creating this T-shaped plan, they are copying in some form Merton. But notice one oddity of the T-shaped plan. When we looked across the transepts at Merton, it's an open view. But here at New College, when you look across the transepts, you in fact have this arcade. This looks to me, in fact, not like just a T-shaped plan, it's a truncated nave. And I suspect that what they're doing is actually imitating what Merton intended to create. Now, as I've said already, William of Wykeham also founds the school at Winchester. Now, the building progress between these two institutions is complicated. The school is founded in 1378, the college in 1379. The college is then built into the 1380s. I think work is sort of nearing completion in the late 1380s. And then attention turns back to build the school. So, as it were, they're founded in inverted order and then built the other way around. This, of course, is Winchester, and the hall and the chapel, again, locked together to form this enormous frontage. Now, internally, these two buildings do something very different but connected. I'm showing you here the famous restored reredos of New College. New College is clearly the senior institution of these two, as is appropriate as a university college as opposed to school college. But at Winchester, instead of this huge reredos, which is of course copied in places such as All Souls in Oxford, at Winchester they create a great east window. This is essentially a sort of cheapened version, I think, of this enormous wall of sculpture. But I think you can see very clearly that they have the same ideas. They're just layer upon layer of a devotional imagery. Now, enough background, but just bear those things in mind. Back to Merton. The first thing to say is this facade has three elements that I'm going to talk about, in fact, four. The door, actually I'm not, that's the parish door, doesn't matter, we'll go into this again. This string course, the sculpture, and the design of the window here. Now, before I say anything more about the window, can I just totally do a piece of stamp collecting? Again, I've done a very expensive drawing on the right, but I just need to introduce what is a sort of technical detail about cusping. It's really sad, okay? But if you imagine, you can have a light at the top left. You can have a trefoil light with cusping, top right. You can have a cinquefoil cusping with 4 cusps in the window. You can have that double cusp where each of those 5 cusps is subcusped. And you can have a very smart alternative, which is called intermediary cusping, where you have a cinquefoil, but only every other element of the cinquefoil is subcusped. Now, if you look at the Merton window, it's got lots of subcusping here and cinquefoil cusping above, but quite a lot of details of additional cusping. Now, just in case you think I'm being completely weird, I'd just like to point out that the use of cusping actually is really quite subtle in important building projects. This is the east walk of Westminster Abbey, and I hope you can see this faces the chapter house, and it has double cusped lights. The next window has cinquefoil lights, and the next window has trefoil lights. This is the important bit, that's less important. And if you turn the corner, you may be able to see this south walk has intermediary double cusping. So I'm not just making this up. This is something you can find in different places. It's a kind of sad detail that I spend my time looking at. So Merton's double cusping, I think, is almost certainly inspired by the east window of this great building. It has an extraordinary number of double cusp lights, as well as cinquefoil lights above. It's basically borrowing this idea. And if you want to see two other details where the north transept is almost certainly lifting ideas from this 13th century structure, look, for example, at that triangular light at the top of the gable. Well, this also turns up in a different form. It's a very, very unusual detail at the top of the north transept. And another thing, the chapel, on the sides of the chapel, it's very unusual at Merton. It has this very heavy carved cornice running along the side of the chapel. Give a lecture about that, but I'm not going to. The density of this above the doorway, I think, is another reference to this 13th century work. I just put this in because one person in the audience will enjoy this. This is the moulding profile. It's actually quite unusual for a window of this kind. This detail is unusual, but let's leave it. We know through... Well, let's talk about chevron now. We know through Tim's work brilliantly that this glass comes from the window, this north transept window. Again, just to emphasize its quality. Thank you. I've got 5 minutes, so we're in a race. So it's worth saying that this window, broadly speaking, is of a type that you find in the late 14th and early 15th century in royal works. I'm showing you here the Italian chapel in Arundel, and I hope you can see that in fact it's a very, very similar window to Merton. But in fact, there are two identical windows to Merton's north transept. I think I was the first person to point out that the east window of Winchester is a copy of, well, Merton is copying the east window at Winchester. And also that in the 1490s, the west window of St Mary's Church in Oxford also has a version of this window. Now, in both, so this is St Mary's and this is Winchester. I hope you can see there are all kinds of details that are precisely lifted between them and which relate back to Merton. What's really interesting about this is we have, in other words, three windows, one probably designed in the 1380s, one designed in about 14 teens, and one designed in the 1490s that all have exactly the same forms. We also know that this window at St Mary's was a very important window. It contained a complete hierarchy of the university as it existed in the 15th century. A really interesting description of this by Anthony Wood, describing all the orders of, rather like the orders of angels, the orders of the university. These are all, and the east window at Winchester, it's a hugely important window. I don't need to go into it. In other words, they're all admired elements of the window. And it's a curiosity that Merton, St Mary's Oxford, one of the figures that appears is the warden of Merton, presumably as a patron. This is Bishop Fitzjames, he's the Bishop of Rochester. He also extends the warden's lodging at Merton. Now, I was going to talk about linearity, but there is no time. So the final thing to look at on the facade is simply the sculpture. Again, I'm going to condense this very much. These two figures of St. John relating, of course, to the dedication of the parish church, and the Virgin relating to the dedication of the college on the front. If you look at the patterns of the vaulting, I hope you can see St. John has a slightly plainer vault than the Virgin, which has a sort of plan vault. And this kind of combination of vaulting is something you find in other works of this period, things such as the York Pulpitum and other buildings of that kind. Just to remind you, this is an age where for masons, canopies are some of the most, they're a vehicle for really brilliant architectural display. I was going to draw some technical comparisons. You may see the curved bases. This is Westminster Hall, Henry V Chantry of the 1440s. So, if I were a betting man, and I do occasionally have a flutter on horses, such as Is No Good, who was no good, it's a reference that David will understand. I would say that one of the very likely designers of the North Transept was in fact a man called Richard Winchcombe, who's a mason who's working for New College in 1408 to 1418, rebuilding the chancel at Abbey. Very annoyingly, all the tracery you see there is restored. But in some ways, identifying or claiming to, everybody likes to attribute things, and I don't really think it's very important. What I do think is important, and what you can say about this triple connection between Merton looking back to Winchester and looking forward to St Mary's, Oxford, is that clearly, first of all, it's an admired design. What is done at Winchester is hugely admired, and that there is a small group of patrons who are seeing the Winchester window, probably then the Merton window, and reproducing it. That in turn is sort of bound up with the way in which we know that contracts operate in this period, where it's very common for a patron to say, I want a window like the one there, of the same quality as the one there. But I think the importance of the stained glass in all these windows actually probably means there's something slightly more going on than merely that exchange of contracts one to another. We are, in other words, looking at something, whoever designs it, it is deeply admired. And the other thing that I think is so important and so confusing to many people about the Perpendicular is that it is a canonic style where ideas that were being developed in the 1340s can suddenly pop up again in the 1520s. They don't need to be persistently used. There's something about it that is picking and choosing from admired architectural details and designs. So in that very quick canter, I hope I've persuaded you that although you should go to Merton to see the 13th century glass, you could also go to see just the North Transept. Thank you very much.
I think he has. Yeah, he has.
Okay, thank you very much, John, for that.
Just
Very
press
nice
up and down.
Such a fascinating, complicated subject, wait for the transaction. So I dare say that's been the case for quite a lot of conversations over this conference. The second paper this afternoon is to be given by Róisín Eckerol, who has a wonderful sounding title. He's worked since 1992 at the restoration department of Nicholas Cathedral in Trinita, and therefore has that rather sort of happy-looking expression as someone whose work is never, in a million years, ever going to run out. However, this afternoon for this conference, you're not going to be talking about the cathedral, that would be, but we'll be talking about huge, difficult, different subject, but there is just one time.
Then it sounds okay in the back? Yeah, fine, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to talk in this occasion on memory of John McNeill. And I'd just like to begin to quote a few lines from one of the Viking Age poems called Hovamol, which is the speak of the highest god, which is about what things are important. Cattle die, kindred die, every man is mortal, but the good name never dies of one who has done well. And I think John did a lot of good and a lot of well things. Baubles and chess. I shall speak about the cathedral a little bit also. Yeah. As you all know, the Louis chess pieces, dated to approximately between 1150 and 1175, are some of the most easily recognized objects from the European Middle Ages and one of the star exhibitions of the British Museum. And I understand that next year, hopefully or probably, some of them are going to be exchanged with other treasures from the British Museum with the Bayeux tapestry, which is coming to the British Museum. Carved of walrus ivory or walrus tusks, A North European or Scandinavian provenance of the carved pieces has long been assumed, and recent DNA analysis have confirmed that most of the walrus tusks found in Europe derived from the west coast of Greenland or Arctic Canada. That is the area between Greenland and Labrador. I shall try to put them more into a context. In 1990, my colleague Chris McLeese and I identified the drawing. Let's see, yeah. This is something you obviously know everything about. We identified a drawing of a small ivory figure, which was found in the ruin of a medieval church in Trondheim in 1885, the drawing here to the right, as a chess queen, very similar to the Louis queens. It had originally been identified as a Madonna and forgotten, and it does not seem to be preserved, I'm afraid. This new insight pointed to Trondheim as a possible place of origin for the Louis chess pieces. We published a short paper on the figure in Medieval Archaeology, and many scholars have later accepted this theory of a Trondheim provenance. And further work by David Caldwell and Mark Hall has strengthened the theory of at least a Scandinavian origin. But can anything new be said about these chess pieces? And here I want to further explore the connection to Trondheim by presenting a new group of figures which until now have not been examined in connection to the chess pieces. And like Donald Trump, we shall now turn our attention to Greenland for a while. Yes. In case you don't know what they look like, you know, it's not Donald Trump. But walruses were the most important natural resource in Greenland. Greenland was populated around the year 1000 by Norse people, mostly from Norway and from Iceland. They had two settlements here on the south settlement and the north settlement, while the hunting grounds were here in the Disco Bay and even further north as time passed on, which is quite important. Walrus products were the main export from the island, in addition to hunting falcons and polar bear skins. The walrus gave tusks and skulls for carving small objects. Its thick hide was cut in narrow strips and braided to create the strongest ropes in existence, used especially on ships. Its fat was melted for oil, used among other things to impregnate ship hulls against sea worms, and the locals ate its meat. So everything could be used. Greenland became a diocese in 1124, and when Norway became an archbishopric in 1153, with Trondheim as the seat of the archbishop, Greenland became part of it. You see the limits of the archbishopric, which is fairly strange, but that is because they encompassed the Norse-speaking areas. People who had, it is a cultural construction. Even the Isle of Man, which was a Hiberno-Irish, Orkney, Shetland, Iceland, Greenland, and mainland Norway. The Greenlandic bishops were appointed by the archbishop, as there were never any chapter in Greenland. And many sources attest to close contact between Norway and Greenland until the connection was broken in the early 15th century. And during the next decades, to the middle of the 15th century, the Norse population disappeared from the island. The causes of this are not determined and are still much debated. This year, an exhibition called Havets Elfenben, or Sea Ivory, bilingual, at the Trondheim University Museum, presents the walrus and its habitat, as well as the various products made of its body. The exhibition presents new material, which in my view strengthens the Trondheim hypothesis. One of them is the result from modern excavations in Trondheim since the 1970s and up till today. They have revealed that along the town's main street, which you see here, running parallel with the river, 5 properties or townhouses contained debris from the working of walrus tusks, whale teeth, and walrus skulls, in addition to antler of elk and reindeer. And one of the workshops has been reconstructed as a drawing here. The traces of processing walrus ivory can be dated from the first half of the 11th century continuously to the middle of the 14th century, showing a continuous tradition during 3 centuries in Trondheim. There were probably also craftsmen in the archbishop's service with their workshops inside the palace precinct. After the Black Death, the import of walrus ivory obviously ceased when the regular contact between Norway and Greenland was broken off. And during the 14th century, African elephant ivory became available in greater quantities, replacing the demand for walrus ivory from Greenland. So they lost the most important things they had to sell. Various written sources tell about the trade in Greenlandic products and the existence of chess sets. In the 1160s, an unnamed English woman married to a Norwegian magnate sent gifts to her brother Anicius, who was then the abbot of Saint Victor in Paris. The gift included a polar bear skin and a walrus tusk. In 1224 or 25, King Haakon IV of Norway sent gifts to King Henry III of England, consisting of 13 grey or white hunting falcons. The white were obviously the most precious, from Iceland or Greenland, walrus tusks, and a polar bear skin. And in 1252, the same king sent a polar bear cub to King Henry, which became a famous attraction in the royal menagerie in the Tower of London for many years, and it was later replaced with other polar bear cubs. They must have been fairly young, because you don't want to share a ship for a couple of months with a half-grown or grown polar bear. I can assure you. Some other, yeah. In 1226, King Haakon, the same King Haakon IV, and his queen Margrethe had the chivalric romance of Tristan and Isolde translated into Norwegian by a certain brother Robert. This was an effort to sort of introduce the most chivalric ideals and culture to the probably rather rough-hewn Norwegian court. The original text, I only have the English version, simply tells that Tristan was raised in a castle by the sea in Normandy, and that he was adopted by wily Norwegian merchants who, quote, having lured Tristan to the ship, bore him off as a rich prize, unquote. The Norwegian version was much elaborated on this point, saying that the ship of the Norwegian merchants was loaded with attractive, luxurious goods, among them the furs of wild animals, falcons, wax, sulfur, dried codfish, walrus tusks, bear skins, and many other things. Tristan visited the ship to look at the goods and noticed a beautifully carved chess set and board, a skaktavlsbord, and challenged one of the merchants to a game. As so often happens in chess, Tristan became so engrossed in the game that he did not notice that the merchant, having decided to abduct him, loosened the moorings and let the ship drift from land. When Tristan finally woke up from this reverie and noticed the ship was far from the coast. This elaborate version surely gave meaning to a Norse audience, depicting a situation familiar to most of them. That is the production of chess sets, not the abduction of princes, I hope. And just the last, in 1340, the King of Norway and Sweden, in his treasury, he had a precious chess set made of ivory, which probably was walrus tusk, unum grossum skaktaffel til filspin factum. Okay, then directly more to Greenland. The Archbishop of Trondheim received large quantities of walrus tusks from Greenland as tax and tithe. Around 1280, Archbishop John wrote to Pope Martin IV, informing him that in addition to hides and sealskin, he received walrus tusks and rope made of walrus hide, dentibus et funibus balenarum, from Greenland as Peter's pence, and asked permission to sell it locally and send the money to Rome, which the Pope granted. This trade lasted well into the 14th century, and it was not small quantities. In 1327, Archbishop Eilif paid the papal tax collector, so this is just to it happens to be preserved. We have very few written sources about this at all. It's not like here in England. He paid the papal tax collector, the Archbishop Rick's 6-year tithe in gold, silver, and 24 walrus tusks, and the 6-year tithe of Peter's pence for the Diocese of Greenland with 1,419 kilos of walrus tusks. That is 1.4 ton. Depending on size, this converts to between 300 and 500 tusks for 6 years, or 150 to 250 animals, which averages killing 25 to 40 animals every year. And this was only what was paid in tithe. The must imperials have been hunting on an almost industrial scale, leading to a lack of large walruses, like with the hunting on elephants, where the hunters went for the bigger animals. The shrinking walrus population seems to have migrated further northwards, which meant that the hunters had to brave increasingly large and hazardous expeditions to find and kill the large animals. In and around Trondheim, a number of walrus ivory projects have been found, like here, including 2 whole tusks found hidden, one of them with a runic inscription dating to the 12th century. The most impressive walrus object is the head of a tow staff, top left, found dated to the 12th century and found in the ruins of the Benedictine Abbey of Holm in the Trondheim harbor. It is a reworked object which originally was longer. A small walrus figure, bottom right, more than indicates its origin, and a similar one has been found in Bergen. An ivory Christ, far left, was found in the ruins of the Dominican friary. And some years ago, a chess king carved of a whale tooth, that's here on the bottom, was found on the beach of an island west of Trondheim. And the famous Digby Crozier head in the V&A depicts a bishop and Saint Olaf, and has then by most been sort of regarded to be carved by the archbishopric in Trondheim. And upper right, a diptych with a small reliefs carved of walrus ivory and depicting the miracles of Saint Olaf to the right and Saint Mary to the left, also has a Trondheim provenance. It's now in the National Museum in Copenhagen, as dated to the early 14th century. Now let's go over to stone. A stone building workshop was established in Trondheim in the second half of the 11th century with the construction of the Royal Christ Church, the predecessor of the present cathedral. Around 1120, a new royal church of St. Nicholas was constructed close to it, described by contemporaries to be richly decorated with carvings. The church is gone. It was demolished around the Reformation, but when the bell story of the cathedral's central tower from the 1530s was taken down, about 1880, many richly decorated stones were discovered. It is likely that these stones derived from St. Nicholas's church. Many contain small reliefs of animals, but also micro-architecture. As you see this with the tympanon, the column inserted in the wall, the so-called tree of life with the lions on the left and the homemade ram and he-goat on the right-hand side. This splendid capital, which is unfortunately recut on one end, is today 38 centimeters tall, and the small column is 11.5 centimeters. The capital is 4 by 3 centimeters, and the male bearded head is only 3.5 centimeters. So it's really small dimensions. And on a ruined church in town, we find also an wall base relief of 2 dragons fighting, biting each other's neck. Very unusual to find it on the outside. And also another capital with the lions. The lions are 8 centimeters high, or the dragons are only 5 centimeters. So it's really very small dimensions. The tradition of small size carvings thus seem to have been established in the 1120s, at least in Trondheim. They are carved in a kind of hard steatite, not the one we hear about from Spain and from Byzantium, which is easy to work with when the stone is fresh from the quarry, but which quickly hardens in contact with air. This stone was used throughout the Romanesque period. As we have seen, the first sculptors mostly made shallow reliefs for which the stone is eminently suited. We also have evidence of rich wood carving tradition in this region during the 12th century. A birchwood chair from the small church at Tyldal, southeast of Trondheim, dating to the 12th century, is so splendidly carved that it must have belonged to a high-ranking person, clergyman, perhaps the archbishop himself. It has a lot of medallions, which look much like gaming pieces, for instance. Two preserved stave church portals from the vicinity of Trondheim also attest to a rich wood carving tradition, and one of them, this one from Rennebu Church, is recently dated by dendrochronology to the period between 1126 and 1171, and its carvings have stylistic similarities with the Louis chess pieces. But this is, of course, just fragments of what once existed. From 1153, when the Archbishopric of Trondheim was established, a large building program began, converting the old two-cell Christ Church into a Romanesque cruciform cathedral. And during the 1150s and 60s, the lower part of the transept was raised in the Anglo-Norman style with two double chapels and one porch with a chapel above it. An inscription in one of the lower chapels dates its dedication to 26th of November 1161, and the corbels must all be made at the same time or only a few years later at most. All the chapels have corbel tables, and in total they contain 37 sculpted corbels, most of which are still well preserved, but they have never been properly studied and published, and very few people have taken any interest in them. As they seem contemporary with the Louis chess pieces, I want to compare these two groups of sculpture to see if there are any common features, and if so, were they made by the same artisans, or at least by the same group of artisans? Can they give us further knowledge about the provenance and the dating of the chess pieces? The most striking feature are the large heads. All the human-like corbel faces have small, narrow mouths and large, bulging eyes with a drilled pupil, most of them surrounded by a narrow roll. The faces have square jaws, especially two corbels, a man and a naked woman. We only show the faces, don't want to provoke you. And these faces, to me, have a very strong likeness with the faces of the chess queens and bishop from the Louis find. Of course, just comparing the facial forms is not evidence, but the presence of an established workshop working in small formats in a stone type, which lends itself to carving minuet details, and the availability of large quantities of walrus ivory in Trondheim over a long period, created a special situation in Trondheim in the 1150s and 60s. I have talked to professional wood and bone carvers and stonemasons who inform me that bone and ivory have more in common with stone carving than the carving of wood and ivory. Wood is so soft that a different technique is necessary for carving. The establishment of the archbishopric in 1153 created, and then there was very little to build on, literally, created a flurry of activity on many levels. A new chapter of canons, a new liturgy, and canonical rules were created. The construction of a new cathedral demanded specialist workers in many fields, and the new clergy needed all kinds of objects like books, furniture, liturgical vessels, and textiles. Taxes and tributes from the 11 dioceses flowed to the new archbishops, among them walrus tusks and other desirable products from Greenland. I suggest that this creative environment also included the production of chess sets for the new elite, domestic as well as international. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Is, well, late afternoon, is a figure, if you don't know who he is, you haven't been paying proper attention. Obviously, one of his most important achievements was to educate Lloyd de Beer, to the point where he managed to deliver an almost credible half-hour paper. Thomas Alexander Hessel is the recent recipient of a knee bruising, is that the term, Róisín? Knee bruising fellowship. He taught for many years, of course, at the University of East Anglia. He has published on ivories, seals, buildings, particularly castles, I suppose I would say, or at least most interestingly. I've been running a little class where I distributed his article on the bio tapestry, seems to be much in the news, and they loved it. A scholar who is always interested in the things he says, and who has been for many years involved in the Norwich Parish Churches project, which is about to manifest itself as a book. He says, he thinks, he hopes, the publishers have promised. So anyway, a rather chaotic introduction to Sandy, but here he is. I must play with the slides. They're clapping before you started, Sandy.
That's good.
Is that it? That's good.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
All right.
How do I
2
work this?
down, 8 up.
Two down.
yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. As Eric Fernie mentioned in the first talk in this wonderful get-together, John McNeill was a student at UEA, and in his first year will have done a 4-week course on Norwich Cathedral. So it seemed appropriate to talk about Norwich, but not just for that reason, but because it was at the BAA conference in 2009 that John came up to me and said, Sandy, how do you feel about organising a BAA conference in Norwich? And I said, I was sitting next to Helen London, and I said, well, if Helen will do it with me, then I'll do it. And so we did. And so we did the Norwich BAA conference, at the end of which, Sandy, don't you think it would be a good idea if there was a project on the parish churches of medieval Norwich? And I said, well, provided Helen will write the grant application. And Helen said yes. And the book is about to come out, as Richard just said, certainly before the end of January. But one of the things that researching that project made me do was think a lot more about Norwich, but it's all really John's fault. So it seems appropriate to give the paper here. So, in 1295, the citizens of Norwich petitioned Parliament for a seal for the recognition of debts. 1295. In 1298, 2 matrices were collected from London by William Butt, a leading citizen of Norwich and sometime bailiff of the city, and John de Kirby, another citizen, clerk. William received the larger matrix, 44 mil across, showing the bust of the king, and John the smaller matrix, or signet, which is 22 millimeters across, which is, I measured one, exactly the size of a £1 coin. And it shows Christ rising from a walled enclosure. This is not the greatest photo. I hope you can make it out. I'll point out a detail or two as we go through. The royal side
is typical of these statute merchant seals, as they are called, and all carry the king's portrait above a leopard. But the signets issued to the various towns and cities were more distinctive. In cathedral cities, several refer to the dedication of the Mother Church. York has St. Peter, London St. Paul, Salisbury the Virgin Mary and Child. Norwich Cathedral is and was dedicated to the Holy Trinity, but what is chosen is not a Nardenstuhl style Trinity, of which more later, but an image of the resurrection. So what you see is a figure blessing, holding an orb with a cross on top of it, rising out of a wall. The complexity of a Trinitarian image at this date would have been hard to accommodate on such a small scale. So the choice of Christ exemplifying his divinity by defeating death was an intelligent alternative. It would be good to know where this decision was made, London or Norwich. Was this self-fashioning on the part of the citizens of Norwich or external branding? I suppose the former, self-fashioning, but I'm open to the alternative view. Either way, the subject had deep religious resonance. When people borrowed money and a record of obligation was sealed, and this was the prime function of the statute merchant seals, the deal was being countersealed with a reminder of the greatest truth, the promise of eternal life through Christ's triumph over death. When the Constitution of what's happened there, sorry. When the Constitution of Norwich was reformed in 1404, and the mayor and bailiffs, a mayor replaced 4 bailiffs, more new seals were made, again in London, by an engraver called Henry Cooper. 2 of these, one I'm showing there on the left, showed Nardenstuhl Trinities, and it's in its established and late medieval form. However, at the Reformation, such images, long contentious thanks to John Wycliffe's opposition, became politically insupportable, and at a meeting of the Norwich City authorities in 1568, it was decided that the mayor's official seal had to be changed. And I quote, "Considering that the seal of the same office, which now is, hath a picture of the Trinity, which is not only contrary to God's word, but also contrary to the Queen's Majesty's injunction, this city do agree that the same seal of the Trinity shall be altered and shall from henceforth have the arms of the city." However, as you can see on the right there, in the event the arms of the city, which were already on the seal anyway, were not engraved to replace the Trinity, but instead Christ rising from his tomb. He is largely naked, having cast off his shroud, but he holds in his left hand, again, a cross-topped orb, to indicate authority over the world and all who dwell there. The mayor of Norwich at the time was Thomas Parker, and his brother, Matthew, also from Norwich, was Archbishop of Canterbury. Matthew Parker's official seal as Archbishop of Canterbury showed the Last Judgment, with a semi-naked Christ above a scene of the dead rising from their tombs, facing hell on one side or the heavenly city on the other. Perhaps, Mayor Thomas Parker reasoned, if a figure of Christ as God and man was acceptable to the head of the English Church, and by implication Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, why opt for heraldry? So the mayor's seal instead took on and developed some of the theology already implicit in the signet of 1298, details such as the blessing right hand and the cross-topped orb. The design of the statute merchant signet made for the city in 1298 itself has two obvious local sources. The city wall, from which the figure rises, depends directly on the seal made for the bailiffs in Norwich in between 1223 and 26, down here, lower right. There, however, it is the castle keep that rises from the walls, not Christ. To find that image, we have to turn back to another seal made for Norwich Cathedral Priory and in use by 1140, lower left. On it, a figure with a cruciform nimbus stretches out his left hand as though ascending, and in the other holds a short staff or scepter. Was this the imagery by which this was the imagery by which the cathedral chapter of Norwich wished to be recognised and validated up to 1258, when they changed their seal. Its imagery, therefore, was revived and revised 40 years later for the city's signet and morphed at the Reformation into the sign of the mayoralty. Its persistence shows the abiding authority of this fundamental tenet of Christian belief in Norwich. In an essay published in 2004 in the volume Medieval Norwich, the historian Norman Tanner suggested provocatively but seriously that it was possible, quote, possible to argue that Norwich, was Europe's most religious city. And he proceeded to make the case. Among the evidence he brought forward were the number of hermits supported by the citizens, the communities of religious women, aside from nuns, closely resembling continental béguinage, the high number of parish churches and clergy sustained in Norwich throughout the Middle Ages, and the citizens' support for the friaries, at least 6 of them at their height in 1330, and hospitals. His principal source of information was bequests in wills. Tanner had read over 1,500 of them. He also highlighted the ownership of religious books by the citizens, again from wills, and the lack of evidence of any overt commitment to lollardy, which was clearly an issue in the surrounding region by the early 15th century. To this list, I would of course add devotion to the resurrected Christ, images of which are plentiful by the standards of surviving religious art anywhere else in Britain. But I start with an object that doesn't survive because it was made of silver. Noted in the inventories of St. Peter Mancroft in Norwich, it is described as an image of silver of our Saviour with his wounds bleeding, his vesture gilt, and a little pyx for the sacrament upon his breast, with a cross and at the foot of the work, weighing 58 ounces. Silver images of the resurrected Christ for the reservation of the host for use on Easter Sunday are known elsewhere. In England, that at Lincoln Cathedral weighed 37 ounces, so 20 ounces less, and that at All Hallows Barking was heavier at 70 ounces. The Church of St. Peter Mancroft, as many of you will know, is the largest in Norwich, in the richest parish, and at the centre of the main complex of marketplaces. Standing opposite the Guildhall, which you can probably just about make out over there on the far left, it was at the heart of civic ceremonial in the city. Unfortunately, we do not know of any form of official Easter ceremonies that might have taken place in the church, and who might have wished or been required to attend them. All that can be seen at St. Peter's today is an intriguing panel painting where am I? Of the resurrection, attributed on its modern label to Jan Provost. But in my view, it is by an English artist well versed in Netherlandish painting of the 1520s, and I suppose it's somewhere about a decade later than that. In addition to the cathedral, of which more in a moment, St. Leonard's Priory, the College of St. Mary in the Fields, Mancroft itself, there were 6 parish churches in Norwich that are known to have had Easter sepulchres. So the devotion was well established in parishes as well as in monastery and collegiate churches. Besides these churches, elsewhere in the city, there were images of the resurrection. Probably the best known is from St. Michael at Pleas from about 1460, which apparently formed the centre of a triptych with Thomas Becket on one side and St. Erasmus on the other. Slightly earlier is a fragmentary alabaster from St. Martin at Oak with Christ's sarcophagus and sleeping soldiers. So this is a typical iconoclastic attack on an individual image. This was found cemented up in a water stoop in the porch after the Second World War. There's no indication that it came from an altarpiece, or a Passion altarpiece. It was found with another fragment of the execution of John the Baptist, and it seems likely that each of them represented individual devotional icons placed in the church. Other representations included a now lost Misericorde from St. Swithin's Church, probably from the late 1550s. St. Swithin's was a bishop's church, and he chose the rector. From 1554 to 58, in the reign of Mary Tudor, the bishop was John Hopton, formerly prior of the Dominican friary here in Oxford, and he had been Queen Mary's confessor. But as the mayoral seal of the next decade indicates, in Norwich, the focus on the resurrection was not simply for Catholics, but for the self-image of the city and the citizens at large. There are many other representations of the subject in Norwich, nearly all, however, in narrative contexts. That is to say, part of sequences of images of Christ's Passion, or the joys of the Virgin, or in sequences in stained glass or manuscript illumination. In 1086, when Domesday Book was put together, there was a church of St. Sepulchre in Norwich, and its successor exists today, presumably on the same site. It is well away from any known centre of population in the 11th century. So the blue arrow at the bottom is St. Sepulchre, and the green long arrow marks the southern boundary of the Anglo-Scandinavian burh south of the River Wensum. So basically, it's 550 meters from the boundary ditch of the city that you have to go out of the city to reach St. Sepulchre. The red arrow is the church of St. Bartholomew, which I'll say a little bit more about. The linkage of the dedications of Bartholomew and Sepulchre is not unfamiliar. In London, St. Bartholomew's in Smithfield is adjacent to St. Sepulchre without Newgate. And at Chichester, as those who attended the BAA conference recently will know, there was a round church, its early designation as St. Sepulchre being changed to St. Bartholomew in the 13th century. In all three cities, Bartholomew's church was associated with butchers or tanners for whom he was patron, and in London at least, with a place of execution, quote, an area set aside for gibbets and other punishments. So all these routes passed by places associated with death, and in Norwich and London on to a sepulchre church. There is a topographical transcription of the sites in Jerusalem of Christ's crucifixion, burial, and resurrection onto a local landscape. To me, this implies a pilgrim's way that could be followed by citizens, perhaps particularly at Easter. It may have had a civic or penitential purpose, but that is only surmise and may remain so. St. Sepulchre was always a rare dedication in Britain. It is worth stressing that the reference in Domesday Book of 1086 makes the Norwich Church by some margin the earliest known St. Sepulchre in England. Regionally, its peer group includes only Thetford and Cambridge, and neither is documented before the early 12th century, and both may have been founded for canons of the Holy Sepulchre, Augustinian canons, though in Cambridge there was already a fraternity by about 1120. Domesday Book also gives the first indication that the Cathedral of East Anglia was to be moved from Thetford to Norwich, for it records that William the Conqueror had given Bishop Herfast 14 dwellings for the principal seat of the bishopric. It was to be a decade before the new cathedral was actually begun, in 1096, by which time its physical layout must have been settled. In what follows, I will discuss three aspects of the design: the plan of the ambulatory and radiating chapels, the form of the semi-dome above, and the use of spiral columns in the nave. All of these will be brief. They will, I argue, all recall aspects of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem and the monument within it, housing Christ's tomb. To begin with the columns, these have generally and quite reasonably been linked with those at Old St. Peter's in Rome, where from at least 400 they apparently formed a screen and supported a ciborium. And you see the famous polar casket there on the left, which people generally take to be a representation of the arrangement in St. Peter's. However, spiral columns, you see the Norwich, one of the four in Norwich on the right there. Spiral columns also have an enduring link with the chapel in the nave of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. When you approach the entrance today, the early 19th century monument, you see four spiral columns on the facade. 15th century depictions of its high medieval predecessor also record them on the entrance wall. Obviously, this is an oblique view, this drawing on the right, so you only see one on this corner, but there was one on the other corner, and I think two in between. But on the far side, you see the much earlier ampulla showing the visit of the Marys to the sepulchre, which is supported on four spiral columns. The connotations of this persistent association are fairly straightforward, of climbing plants, as it might be bindweed and honeysuckle, coiling upwards from the earth towards the light. At Norwich, four spirals are placed around the altar in front of the door through the choir screen or pulpitum, so also notionally at the entrance to the choir and presbytery. The main apse of Norwich Cathedral was surmounted by a masonry semidome with ribs rising from slender shafts running up the walls from the capitals of the piers at ground level below. In the paper I gave at the first BAA Romanesque conference, called From Shell Niche to Ribbed Semidome, I suggested that for various reasons, seashells were metaphors for resurrection, not least because an inorganic shell encased contained life within it, as Christ was contained in the tomb. And here is a pre-Christian example of a shell being used to signify a journey to the afterlife. And on the left, the Aumbry from, Aumbry from Torcello Cathedral, which I used to think was 11th century, but John McNeill told me it was 6th, so I've changed it to 6th. So the association of shells and ribbed semidomes also relates to Christ's resurrection. Of course, ribbed semidomes and spiral columns are not unique to Norwich. Rather rarer is Norwich's use of ambulatory chapels with round naves and protruding apses to the east. This was broadly the form of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem after its renovation in the first half of the 11th century. And you see the plan over there on the left. So we're talking about the big rotunda and the small apse off. And Ersten was telling me earlier that at the time, the spaces between these columns was effectively blocked. So that was a separate circular space with the apse to the east. I hope I got that right, Ersten. So I see these ambulatory chapels as copies, small-scale copies of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's also possible to see the main apse and axial chapel at Norwich as versions of the same idea. The dedication of the high altar was, of course, to the Trinity, with the chapel to the east, this axial chapel here, dedicated to the Saviour. The chapel to the south, to St. John the Baptist, and that to the north to St. Stephen and All Martyrs, and sometimes called the Holy Innocents Chapel. So they too were martyria, celebrating the first Christian martyr, Stephen, the last murdered prophet, John the Baptist, either side of the Trinity, with the God-man, Christ, our Saviour, further east. The Easter ceremony at Norwich Cathedral is codified in its late 13th century customary. From the placing of the cross in the sepulchre on Good Friday to its elevation on Easter Sunday morning. The location of the sepulchre from at least 1278 is defined by a two-bay chapel, largely of stucco, spanning the north aisle. But it is likely that this largely reinstates the Romanesque arrangement, since, as we have seen, the mid-12th century priory seal shows Christ rising from such a two-bay structure. The so-called dispenser retable, perhaps from the ambulatory chapel immediately east of that Easter sepulchre, perpetuates this unusual imagery of Christ's rising in a two-bay vaulted structure. So it was apparently important to witness the actuality of Christ's resurrection in the immediate setting of the church. So, final paragraph. A reasonable conclusion is that Bishop Herbert of Norwich was personally committed from the outset to inscribing this fundamental tenet of Christian belief in his new cathedral. What is much less clear is how this relates to the pre-existing Church of the Holy Sepulchre, some half-mile to the south, or to the choice of the resurrection for the city's seals in the late 13th and 16th centuries. My inclination is to see Herbert as building on an existing devotion, thereby further encouraging its development and the commitment of citizens to its celebration. This material does not prove Tanner's contention that Norwich was the most Christian city in Europe. How could you do that? Though it is a factor in its favour. However, the rebuilding of the city walls from 1294, the year before the statute merchant seals were requested, City walls with their 12 gates referencing the heavenly Jerusalem suggest a determination to promote Norwich as the ideal city, ruled ultimately by Christ, the resurrected God-man. That strategy, whether externally imposed or internally adopted, cannot but have affected how the citizens saw themselves and how they were regarded by others. Thank you.
Please don't run away with the microphone. You're on. Yeah. Splendid. Thank you for that, Sandy. That was wonderful. Our next speaker, he says, dropping things all over the floor, is also one of the great figures of medieval studies in this country. Neil Stratford was, of course, for many years, keeper of late antique and medieval at the British Museum. Importantly, I suppose, he was also someone, has also always been someone who was very engaged in wider European scholarship. And as such, I guess it's fair to say, someone who will have run across John, therefore, in circumstances beyond the BAA, in the mountains of Kusha. And he, of course, also has produced some works of amazing scholarship. The big volume on Cluny was mentioned earlier on, in which Eric and John collaborated on an article. His immortality, however, will doubtless be assured by the publication of Gothic Leaves, which I have to say, I mean, you may chuckle, but I spent 5 minutes looking at it this morning and it looks terrific. A characteristic blend of kind of Stratford breadth and learning and close observation. Now I'm going to have to give you that, put it in your pocket.
This goes in my pocket.
Yeah. That should go there.
Yes.
And
Okay.
it's this one to advance.
2 and 8. Yes.
Yeah, 2 and 8.
2 and 8.
Good.
Well, I have a barrister daughter, and when I told her that I was the last speaker at this conference, and she said, "Oh, we call it the graveyard slot." So I feel as if I'm, yes, well, you know, in a graveyard. You're all longing to get on the train. The last thing you want is a lecture on Bacile and Avalon and other monuments. But the reason I'm giving this lecture, which is too long, by the way, I warn you, I shall have to stop. But I know you will. You always do. But the reason I'm giving it is because I thought it was in the spirit of John, because John loved to travel. And he was a traveller, and I thought a lecture ought to go all over the place, you know, and go to lots of monuments, just like John would in one day, you know, just lots and lots of monuments. Isn't that so, Anna? That's right. So here we go. Here we go. Now, let's see if I can find it. 2, you said. That's true. That's terrific. Yes, that's terrific. It works. Well, I'm going to ad lib. We're below the Madeleine on the hillside at Rewley in the Morvan. And this is on the right, the hillside, where at Easter in 1146, Bernard of Clairvaux preached the Second Crusade to a multitude of thousands. Well, statistics in the Middle Ages are always up for grabs, but it obviously was, and the most colossal of audiences.
an interesting question arises at the very start. How on earth did these sermons work? How on earth could somebody make themselves heard? And I suppose they must have had some sort of megaphone, the system. They must have, but it's worth thinking about because they would have been stretched right down the hillside, right away from the speaker. Nobody would have been able to hear him directly. It's a very interesting question. On the left, you're standing on the site of what was to be built in the 13th century as one of the first Franciscan churches in France. In 1217, Brother Pacifique colonized or was lent the Church of the Holy Cross, which you see in the slide on the left. This is the altar end. The east end is on the right of that left-hand slide. And the Abbot of Vézelay lent the first Franciscan group in France this as a temporary building, and they later established themselves here. So you're standing on the site of the later Franciscan church, which no longer exists, with the Chapel of the Holy Cross still standing more or less beyond. And now this has gone eight, yes. And this is the interior of the chapel. It's probably centrally planned, dedicated to the Holy Cross. We know that from a number of near contemporary chronicles. It's one of the best documented of early Gothic buildings in France. Very little known, very little thought about, with very heavy roll mouldings and a rib vaulted chancel with a 3-torus profile and little congé at the bottoms of the rolls, and a magnificent set of capitals. I'll come back to them in a second. But the fact here is that we're in the central vessel of the building. The south and the western buildings have gone, but to the north, and you're looking at the north facade on the left, is a blocked arch, which I think must have given out onto the area where the wooden tribune was, where Bernard stood and preached. And on the right, just one of the very beautiful, richly decorated acanthus capitals, which decorate the Church of the Holy Cross. The date. The chronicles tell us, more than one, that it was built by Abbot Pontius, the brother of Peter the Venerable, the great Abbot of Vézelay, after, therefore, Easter 1146, and before his death in 1161. One of the chronicles, that of Saint Colomb-les-Sens, adds a very interesting detail. It says that the King of France ordered the Abbot of Vézelay to build this church. Is there another church known in early Gothic France where a royal patronage is actually defined in a document? I don't think there is. Why people don't look at this building and take it seriously, I really don't know. One of the capitals here is particularly beautiful, I think, a floral medallion capital. And it's interesting also because it tends to make me think that the same masons were working up at the Madeleine at more or less the same time, and in this case on a walk of the cloister. This capital almost certainly comes from the lost cloister at Vézelay, and the reason for that is that the so-called, rather euphemistically, excavations of Viollet-le-Duc in the 1840s, unearthed a number of fragments on the site of a cloister, of which this is one, and he replaced with replicas the capitals that he found there, and that is one of them. So I think there's a rather fragile, perhaps, evidence that the same masons who built the Holy Cross Church worked up at the Madeleine, and not only there in a cloister, but also here we're in the narthex of the great church, looking southeast in the narthex at the upper level, with the tribunes running along on the south side, and that's the west wall on the left, with the three Taurus rib mouldings, exactly the same as in the cordel, in the Holy Cross. And the bays I'm going to talk about are the one on the left there, and the one which is just hidden in the corner in the southeast, just there. There are two very significant and important sculptures in this part of the Church of the Tribunes, which are, first of all, a very beautiful vault boss with angels and richly decorated acanthus, which is now in the Musée Lapidaire. It was replaced by Viollet-le-Duc with a copy, and it was the vault boss of the central bay of the tribunes. And on the right here is a very strange niche with fluted pilasters and richly decorated drilled acanthus leaves and an impost block, and a niche with a richly draped figure in the niche. And it's not a piscina, which you might think it was. And I really don't know what this pier was doing. I don't know what it's for. I don't know what the figure was. The head's gone. But it's a real enigma, that. But it's a very important sculpture, that, because as we'll see, it's very like the sculpture at Avalon, which I'm going to show you in a minute. And on the left of the screen is a detail of the detached shafts of this early Gothic campaign at Vézelay. This is the last campaign of construction on the interior of the great church, of a great Romanesque church. It marks a complete rupture in architectural style with all that went before it. And it's clearly marked by influence from the very earliest Gothic buildings in the Ile-de-France. I mean, things like the narthex at Saint-Denis. There are triple shafts, triple impost blocks, detached shafts, a pair of double shafts carrying a single arch, and so on. This is the sort of architectural language which you get in the Ile-de-France and in the Senonet from the 1130s and 40s onwards. And this is just a composite slide that I made years ago with some of the acanthus capitals, the rich acanthus capitals, which are also found in that part of the tribunes as well, as in the cordel, in the Holy Cross, with capitals from on the left, it's the Holy Cross. Top right, it's the chapter house at Vézelay a little later. Bottom left is the tribune detail I've just shown you. Bottom right is a capital at Avalon. Avalon is a few miles from Vézelay on a rocky escarpment of the Morvan, built within the walls of the Viscounts of Avalon. Its statute is very unclear from documents. There is a very strange gift of the Church of Avalon to Cluny in 1078 from the Duke of Burgundy, whose centre of power was in Dijon, far to the east. but there's no other mention of Cluny in connection with Avalon that I've ever come across. And anyway, how could it possibly be? Because they were regular canons. And I can't see how Cluny could possibly have been involved really at Avalon. I think the Bishop of Autun was probably the moving spirit here. Anyway, at Avalon, one column figure survives on the west door. The building is very traditional, without a whisper of early Gothic in most of it, a traditional barrel-vaulted elevation of a single and rather rapid construction campaign, I think, probably of the 1160s. I think the chronology of this church has been rather conservatively pushed back, sort of into the 1170s. Sturmer, a German thesis by a man called Andreas Sturmer, for instance, was the 1170s. But anyway, whatever, I think the church was quite rapidly built. And finally, and the other point about Avalon is that it's one of those churches of which there are a great many in the Romanesque period, where the interior is almost iconic. But that does not mean that it's austere. There's an enormously rich foliage sculpture, but no figures, or almost no figures. And I think it's worth thinking about. I mean, there are many churches like that in Provence, in Italy, and so on. And another one in Burgundy is the Cathedral of Langres, for instance. And Avalon is like that. There's hardly a single figure within the interior of Avalon. It's when you get to the west front that you get this plethora of figure sculpture. Here is Dom Urbain Planchet, the Moorist monk, very famous and well-known engraving of the central door of Avalon before it was ravaged by first of all, the fall of the tower and so on in the 16th century. And I show it to you, it's very important for my argument, really. I show it to you because those of you who can see it, the 18th century engraving, will notice that on the right-hand jambs of the central door, the two column figures play out the drama of the Annunciation. They're not isolated. They're not monolithic statues. They interact. They're absolutely not, in my opinion, emphatically, descendants of the monolithic Chartrain portal. This is the Portail Royal at Chartres, you'll recognize it. I want from the very beginning to make it clear that I think that the dogma that all the column figure portals of early Gothic France descend from Saint-Denis and/or Chartres is mistaken. I think there are various strands, there are various families, and that people were quite capable of coming up with different sorts of solutions in isolation from just one fons et origo. And people tend to make these isolated, sort of monolithic statue columns the source of the column figure portal in France, and I don't believe it. Here is another one which enters the argument. This is another of Dom Urbain Planchet's engravings, 18th century engravings, at least he published them, he didn't make them. And this is Saint-Bénigne at Dijon. The west door no longer exists, but we have certain fragments from it. I was going to show you them. Here is a plate from Schlink's book on the Cathedral of Langres with two of the heads from the west door of Saint-Bénigne at Dijon. I show them to you because the first thing that everybody says is, oh, well, the earliest column figure door in Burgundy is at Dijon. It was the west front of Dijon. It may even be earlier than Chartres and blah, blah, blah. Well, the point about that is really a very simple one, I think. It is that one's got to think a bit more historically about this. Burgundy then is not Burgundy now, which is a series of modern départements. the counties of Auxerre and Nevers and the bishopric of Autun, so on, were politically and totally, I mean, very, very different from ducal Burgundy, the Capetian ducal Burgundy, which had its sources in Dijon and Langres further east. And I think, therefore, we can dismiss Dijon out of the sort of Burgundian argument, if you know what I mean. And the column figure portals that we're going to just see in a second come, in my opinion, from a different family. It likes Schlink so much that it won't move on. It's jammed. Yeah, thank you. And here's a detail of the beautiful column figure at Avalon, the rich acanthus. We'll get very used to this acanthus, and this is not possibly derived from some sort of Chartrain family. It comes out of a whole different stylistic orbit. And here is a detail of the angels of the central portal of Avalon. Wonderful sculpture, I think, and very closely related to that niche figure that we saw in the tribunes at Bacile. And just very quickly, this is an aside, one or two other monuments which belong to this workshop or this current of style. A very beautiful and extraordinary monument just south of Avalon, which is not at all well known, and I can't understand why. It's the sarcophagus of Saint Magnance, which is 7 kilometers south of Avalon. And Saint Magnance is the tradition says that she was one of the companions of the body of Saint Germain when it was carried from Ravenna to Auxerre in the 5th century. And her body was buried in the porch of this little priory near Avalon, and it's then was moved into the presbytery where it now is. It was heavily restored, as you can probably see, in 1848-49 by the architect Abbey, but it's a wonderful sculpture and a unique monument, an absolutely unique monument which belongs to this Avalon group of monuments. And it's a very, very important and significant thing. And I've got one detail of it. This is the sculpture of one of the scenes of the death of Germain. And you can see again this heavily ribbed drapery, which is typical of this workshop. Saint Magnance was a priory of Saint Jean de Réaume, Saint Moutier Saint Jean, Benedictines. And yet another, the last of Don Planchet's engravings that I'm going to show you because it's useful, because once again we're dealing with a portal which has been massacred by time, but the 18th century engraving shows clearly the column figures, and this is my theme really of this evening, where on the left the three magi are coming across the portal to the Virgin and Child on the right-hand jambs. So once again, the figures on the jambs are interacting, acting out a drama. And this is Vermonton today in a rather sad condition. On the left, two of the magi survive, and on the right, the very battered figure of the Virgin and Child. They are on the opposite sides of the portal, about 1160, I should think, Vermonton, which is very near Auxerre. One or two other monuments could be brought into the argument. This is a rather a sort of footnote, really. a little church at Lucy-le-Bois, near Avalon again. They're just two Romanesque carvings which survive there on the west door. One on the right, typical Avalon foliage, acanthus. I hope you've all got your eyes in on it now and recognize it and say, hey, that's Avalon acanthus. And on the left, a head, which I suspect may be recycled from a column figure, but I'm not sure about that. And the third portal with dynamic column figures, I'm going to use that expression from now on, is at Parly in the Puisay, which is the granite region to the west of Auxerre. This is the portal of Parly as it is today, a parish church. And I'm sorry to say that this is the result of a recent restoration, or if I might say vandalization of this portal. It's very tragic, really. And the figure, which is absolutely fascinating, we've got Avalon acanthus as usual here, but the figure that interests me is here, replaced by a modern terrible copy. Here is a figure touching the column, which I suppose is Samson. But when I first went to Parly in 1967, I'm sorry to say it was, there are the Avalon acanthus on the right. On the left, that is the figure as it was in 1967. And you can make out that it was a figure touching the column. So again, a column figure which is actually taking part in an action, is actually a dramatic column figure. So I think my conclusion is that in this northern part of Burgundy, the dynamic column figure, as I've christened it, was endemic. I think it was part of the architectural landscape. Well, already in the 1120s, at Bacile, in the great church, beneath the great portal going into the nave, we had huge figures of apostles interacting between themselves. Here we have Peter and Paul in dialogue in the 1120s. And in 1135 to 40-ish sort of period, the exterior facade of the narthex of Madeleine was being built. Today, of course, the tympanum is from 1858 to 59, François Michel Pascal, in response to a commission from Viollet-le-Duc. But we have the original tympanum. I'm not showing you the details of it here and now, but I believe there's very little doubt that the very idiosyncratic survivals of the central tympanum show that it was carved by the famous Gislebertus of Autun, who was studied by George Danetsky and so on. We're all familiar with that famous book. And so here on the exterior of the narthex at Bacile, in 1135, 40, that sort of period, we had an Autun tympanum and running up and down the jambs here, fragments of a series of virtues and vices. And here on the left is Largitas and Avaritia. They're there because they must have been conceived to accompany column figures. There's no other conceivable reason why they'd be there. And so whether the column figures were ever actually executed, we don't know, of course, but that must be their raison d'etre. There's no other possible explanation for them. And on the right, I show you a detail of the portail Weil chart, where similar virtue and vice groups are shown next to a column figure here on the right, on the portail Weil.
Neil, you must end soon.
Oh, right, okay. Well, that being the case, I won't take us into Spain. I was going to show you Avila, San Vicente at Avila, which is so clearly related to the Avalon Canthus. That's in the West Tribunes. This is the reused south door of Avila, and this is the west door of Avila, where you can see that the dynamic column figure portal is in full play. And my final monument is going to be the West Crypt of Santiago, with a very heterogeneous collection of sculpture, including one beautiful vault boss, which goes right back to Avalon. It's an interesting fact that the Avila Avalon connection was first spotted in 1895 by Camille Lanla. He's a very much underestimated art historian, extraordinary thing, and I think a better art historian in some ways than Kingsley Porter. And he was very extraordinary. He did wonderful work on the Crusader castle, and so that was him. And here is more of the Avalon Acanthus at Santiago. And what I think about the crypt at Santiago, you have early Gothic foliage capitals. You have still echoes of the Vézelay Avalon tradition and the dynamic column figure portal. And you also have the beginnings of works by the Master of Matteo workshop down in the Western Crypt at Santiago. And so I think it's hardly a coincidence that when Matteo does his great Portico della Gloria above, he inherits the tradition of the dynamic column figure portal, which he doesn't inherit from the Chartrain tradition. I think he inherits it from the Vézelay Avalon tradition.
A couple of minutes for questions before the concluding remarks from Manuel. Do I have a volunteer to carry around the microphone? Good. So, any questions? Stunned into silence. Julian Luxford, right at the back. It's on. You can hand it to Jan. You may need that.
I'm not saying we say that there's full art, but I do think that these things in their own way is brilliant. And I'm sorry to drill down those details, Danny, but I wonder if you can tell me if you think that seal from Norwich Priory, some sort of precursor to the Baron Seal of London, or is that quite a common thing, single figure rising above them? I've thought about this long and hard without coming to any serious conclusion. The origin of that format is the golden bulls of the German emperors. There's one in 1125, but it doesn't look very like the Norwich seal. There's another which is too late to be the source of the Norwich seal, and there's a gap in between. But that whole business of the figure and the city, of course, starts being come up in French civic seals during the 12th century. So by the time we get to the London seal of 1219, if that's the right date, this sort of patron saint standing over a city motif
is quite widespread in Western Europe. So I think it's all part of a single trajectory, but it starts with the Aurea Roma side of the imperial bulls in the mid-11th century and gradually morphs, gaining a figure and then becoming a cityscape with a standing state.
Thanks very much.
Alex, oh dear, and please don't trip over my coat and break your neck.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for these wonderful papers. My question is for Neil, and I wanted to ask you, Neil, that I thought that was so wonderfully convincing, but whether you would range with this material the limpers from La Charité, Solois, or whether that is a different context.
You're referring to the Bernet and Plagneur's thing about all the details of La Charité at Chartres. Is that what you're?
La Charité sur Loire.
Yeah, no, I know. No, I mean, is that what you're asking? I didn't quite understand the question. Yes.
Piercing of the eyes, whether you think that comes from a similar tradition or whether that belongs to something else.
The piercing of which eyes?
The drilling of the eyes.
Of which eyes?
Of all the figures?
All the figures. Well, I suppose that if you were asking me where that wonderful figure at Avalon, where that head, what the pedigree of that head is, I don't think I'd go to La Charité. I think I'd go to the Lazarus tomb at Autun. I think that's what I'd do. Yes.
Thank you.
But you may be right. I
wanted to know what.
Yes.
Okay, there seems to be no hands waving. What happened to Anne? Oh, there you are. Let's see.
Should we applaud the speakers?
Oh, yeah.
Two and a half days of interesting papers given by John friends and colleagues in memory of his own scholarship and learning. But I'd just like to say a word on behalf of his students. So many of us are still, we're still missing him, of course, but we have now got this wonderful background of knowing the difference between Romanesque and Gothic, how an English cathedral works, with wonderful things that are at Gilderdale and Abenza, for instance, the development of Santiago, the pilgrimage site. In fact, this time last year, I was into the fourth of 6 courses. He was talking here about the history of Northern cathedrals. Unfortunately, it never finished. There's hundreds of people, if not thousands, walking about today who can recognise a Niçois, a Dosseret, a Lodigo-G, obviously he had a rocking triangle. That's really nice. And the thing that I always have difficulty with, but I'm sure I'm not the only one, who feels really pleased when they remember the word hotel. I mean, this terribly goes without saying, but we're all the richer for his kindness, patience, infectious enthusiasm, which will stay with us always. So I put my other hat on now and say, on your way out, please put your badges in the box in the foyer, and please also look at the website and the newsletter and see the advert for our 12th night party the 7th of January next year, and hope you'll all be here. We'll be there. Thank you.
I have great numbers of thanks that I should extend. Many of them very obvious, some of them perhaps less obvious to you. I started by saying I had the dream team of Anne Hignell and Catherine Milburn, who has been canonised, I believe, during the course of this to do all the hard work. We've been extremely well looked after by Rewley House. And of course, I have been in a state of great neurosis that my speakers would either not make it or deliver terrible papers. But it's been an extraordinary show, ladies and gentlemen. It's been really, really, really marvellous. Thank you so much to all of those of you who've spoken and have chaired. We will hope, I hope, to turn this into a volume in memory of John, which, in a way, I need to make a pitch to Taylor and Francis, and I need to convince them that a book is suitable, where we have, on the one hand, the movements of the Thames, and on the other, paths to spiritual enlightenment in late Anglo-Saxon England. I mean, it's been extraordinarily broad, and yet, of course, so often something that we felt John would have delighted in. I am going to be helped in my thanks by Manuel Castañeras, who's going to say a few words in a moment, but I should conclude my thanks by thanking Tim and Jerry, who helped hugely with us putting this on. I'm being told to shush. I get that I would never disobey you, but thank you so much. Another, I suppose, unintroducible figure. Manuel Castañeras is, of course, one of the most active figures in the European study of Romanesque art. Again, very varied in the subjects he has engaged in. And I suppose also it's relevant to say how important Manuel has been in the International Romanesque Conference, into which John put so much effort. And while I'm on that subject, there should be also thanks for the support of John Osborne to that project. Those of you who've heard that John has been unwell, he is making some steady progress in recovering his health, which is good news indeed. And again, on that note, don't forget to sign up for the Toulouse conference in mid-April. If you don't sign up quickly, it will probably sell out. So please do. Again, details on the website. Manuel, 15 minutes. 15 minutes. 15 minutes.
Help me with the. Yeah. This is here. Okay. Here. Can open. Right. So good evening. I have to sum up a little bit my closing remarks because most of you are in a rush, waiting for a train. Anyway, these 3 days have been wonderful and rewarding. We have followed 27 papers on a variety of topics presented by scholars from different countries: the United Kingdom, the USA, Norway, France, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, and Spain. The BEA has organized this scholarly event in memory of John McNeill, who, as you know, enjoyed your talks a lot in the past. Boundaries and Encounters in Medieval Art and Architecture is the perfect title to commemorate a man who devoted his career to journeys and research aimed at an unveiling the complex character of medieval artistic creations, where each building and artwork stands as a crossroads of traditions spanning past and present and across political boundaries. We extend our thanks to Richard Plant, Julian Luxford, Alexandrina Buchanan, and Jana Gajdosova for the careful selection of papers, and to other BAA staff members, especially Anne Hinkle and Catherine Milburn, for organizing this event so effectively. Many thanks as well to Tim and Jelly Harris for your generous donation. Choosing a topic for these remarks proved easy. During one of my last conversations with John in Oxford, we discussed Nicolaus Pesner's biography, written by Susie Harris and published in 2011. John was reading it with genuine enthusiasm. During our chat, we discussed various topics related to Pesner as a German scholar naturalized in England. His most famous contribution to English art history is its Building of England series, widely known as the Pesner. Comprising 46 county gazettes that represents one of the greatest scholarly enterprise of the 20th century. As you know better than I, traveling through English counties require picking up the appropriate Pesner from the shelves. At the end of that conversation, we discussed the concept of design and architecture related to English art. With this, for a Spanish scholar, English medieval art is something of a maze. From Romanesque downfall style to perpendicular Gothic, categories often quite distant from European norms. John, who spends his career with one foot in Britain and the other on the continent, was genuinely fascinated by these distinctions and their opposites. Indeed, part of his research focused on showing how English Romanesque art connects to the rest of Europe, particularly Western France. Yet, he also recognized the strong singularity of British art. This debate is not new. However, it has been developed primarily by foreign scholars working in England who attempted to examine these connections with fresh eyes. Some speakers of this conference have explored these very topics. For example, this morning, John Munns. My starting point will be Pesner, who was reluctant to recognize European depths and believed English art had largely escaped the system. Conversely, George Janeski was more attuned to international bonds and worked to integrate English Romanesque art into the European canon with important results. The conversation with John prompted me to revisit a book Pesner published in 1956, The Englishness of English Art. This grew from the Wraith Lectures, broadcast by the BBC in October and November 1955. In these lectures, Pesner explores qualities he regarded as distinctly English and what they reveal about English national character. All 7 chapters are available in the BBC player, if you want to listen to. For someone like me, a Spaniard brought out hearing the old tourist slogan, Spain is different. Pesner's book offers insights into things I had perceived while visiting cathedrals, monasteries, and parish churches across England. Pesner wrote that English art often it even escapes the accurate dating by style, which is the art historian's ambition. He also observed that continental visitors find it puzzling that English churches never accept stone vaulting as the one and the only dignified thing for a church of any pretension. One of them. As you know, and I am going to sum up now, I hope in the proceedings to expand on it. There are three principal main ideas in these lectures of Pesner. The first is conservatism figures prominently. English medieval painting shows a striking conservatism. For example, all the, you know about the copies about the Utrecht Psalter. The second, the perpendicular style, an angular forms designed to emphasize cubic composition also matter a lot. In Norman style, the flat chancel succeeds, as seen in Old Sarum and Hereford. Pevsner view this as reflecting Anglo-Saxon preference, for example, Dirhast. Or the Anglo-Saxon designers favor decoration of external wall surface with vertical or horizontal strips and arches, and rather open triangles, not true arches, like that. Okay. This same tendency persists even in mid-Gothic. Pesner relates to the pre-conquest tradition other characteristics like the division of a state into separate self-contained units. In English art, shafts and arches are not separated by the logical Greco-Roman tradition backed by capitals and abbacy. Instead, continuous molding units shaft and arcs as a single line, as Malmesbury Abbey's portal. Even arch loses its logic, as seen in the interlaced arches of Wenlock Chapter House. This reflects a preference for a flat wall surface and surface quality, resulting in architectural design that prioritizes linearity. Okay. Even in that. And the flaming line constitutes another defining feature and forms this scintillating line appears in 10th, 11th century English illumination, and there are the roots in the former tradition. So, line rather than a body, his conclusion, England is not fundamentally a cultural nation. Most normal decoration is abstract rather than figural. So now I'm going to sum up because we don't have time. So I choose one case that is the Ely portals, the Ely Cathedral. You know, that most or less are related with these ideas. In my thinking about that, I trying to show these peculiar things about the two portals, the monks' portal and the prior portal. So the book of Zarnecki is very crucial for the study of the cathedral. And Zarnecki, in his study, was very focused in date and study these portals. And the most interesting proposal of Zarnecki is this comparison with Pavia. But in the same book, Zarnecki recognized the depth of the portal and the composition with the Anglo-Saxon tradition and the Anglo-Norman illumination. This is the comparison who Pevsner made in this book, very interesting about all these relationship between Anglo-Saxon and the Romanesque art. So, as for the dating, the sculptures clearly belong to the development of the English Romanesque sculpture in the first few decades of the 12th century. Zarnecki placed Ely around 1135, based on comparisons to Italian sculpture. However, as Eric Fernie suggested, the date could be earlier, around 1100, 1120. Both those styles closely relates to the pre-conquest Anglo-Saxon repertoire and decorative work at the style derived from Anglo-Saxon illumination. And this is I am getting to the point. Although Zarnecki comparison to Pavia is visually compelling, the resemblance probably results from similar decorative processes, flatty, ornamented, Archaean style. In Pavia, they are going back to the Longobards. In my view, the Ely's portals show no real Italian connection, and their date may well be around 1120. The male figures seated on the lions, that is one of the topics of Zarnecki, are not precisely equivalent to Italian Telamoni or Atlantis. Their position may still reflect inspiration from gospel canon tables. I show that, but this is not the topic. In conclusion, the Romanesque doors of Ely exemplified Englishness compellingly. The saucer are Anglo-Saxon, yet their architectural framework is Norman. Aesthetically, they root themselves in the old tradition of decorative surfaces and the flaming line, now refreshed and renewed through adoption of the Romanesque architectural language. Zarnecki's scholarship on Romanesque art and his integration of English production into European Romanesque built up upon ideas advanced by Arthur Kingsley Porter. The concept of pilgrimage and circulation proved genuinely useful in constructing a discourse based on connectivity that transcended all nationalisms and chauvinism. However, recent decades have reassessed this approach, and our field cannot progress unless we establish, in each case, the boundaries of artistic tradition and the context of alleged encounters. Pevsner's scholarship, by contrast, relied heavily on the older concept of national art, rooted in cultural geography, national character tied to land, climate, and custom. His precedent custom was the Viennese art historian Dagobert Frey's book, Englisches Wesen in der bildenden Kunst. I am finishing. So, one of the John McNeill's great intellectual legacy is the VAA International Romanesque Conference. This series began in 2010 under his direction and the Richard Plant co-direction, with generous sponsorship from John Osborne. To date, 7 conferences have been held: London, Palermo, Barcelona, Oxford, Poitiers, Hildesheim, and Valladolid. Next April, we will hold the 8th in Toulouse. This conference aimed to create dialogue between Northern and Southern Europe and between Anglophone and Latin European scholarship to discuss Romanesque, while also promoting Romanesque studies in Britain, which were then in sharp decline, 2010. The first objective has clearly succeeded, as our audience demonstrates. The second objective to foster a scholarly interest in British Romanesque studies remains a task for future generations. What distinguished John McNeill's approach from those to Zarnecki and Pevsner was his expansion of research to continental monuments, enhancing understanding of Anglo-European ties and difference. Anjou, Aquitania, and Apulia became fields of study, allowing him to develop fresh insights into the Anglo-Norman art. An exemplary work, and I'm coming back to the starting point of Eric Fermi, an exemplary work of his groundbreaking article on the Herefordshire School and his reassessment of figurative sculpture at Kilpeck Church. The over-exuberant sculptural decoration, big heads, monsters, grotesque image caught Zarnecki attention in the 1950s. As with the Prior's door in Ateli, Zarnecki regarded Kilpeck as a melting pot drawing from across Europe. Scandinavia wooden churches, Western France, even the Way of St. James. He attributed this hybrid product to Olivier of Merlimont, Hughes Mortimer chief steward, who went on pilgrims to Santiago de Compostela, proposing that the church's thematic complexity mirrored his geographyless passion. McNeill challenged this hypothesis, demonstrating first that Kilpeck was completed in 1134 before Merlin-Mont's journey to Compostela, and second, that nothing in Kilpeck's sculpture lies outside Norman traditions. All elements root themselves in Anglo-Norman sculpture, with carvers coming from Hereford Cathedral. This does not preclude the later Hereford School's incorporation of Aquitaine sculpture motifs and compositional methods, as seen subsequently at Charlton. This is a good example of how to address artistic problems where regional and transregional elements may or may not converge. John challenged us to identify precisely the boundaries and encounters in medieval art in each specific case. This is his enduring legacy. I look forward to reading your contributions in the conference proceedings. Thank you very much.
There are no more papers. It feels slightly strange. Someone will bounce up and say more to us. But thank you all for coming. We hope to see many of you in January, and particularly thank you to those who come at great distances to be here. We are now anxious about their trains. One last reminder about a point that's been made frequently about John's encouragement of young scholars. We have established a fund in his memory, which will be used in the future for student scholarships. So if you're feeling your pockets are heavy, again, by going to the website, you find a way to donate to John McNeill Fund. That is a bit of a, are you? Yes, that did sound like the kind of begging letter at the end of the conference. I apologise, but it's been lovely being amongst you. Thank you all very much for coming and preserving John in our hearts. Thank you.
Thank you.